Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into a world where a single glance could ruin a reputation, where touching someone's bare hand was scandalous, and where the flutter of a fan might mean the difference between love and social death. Imagine living in a time when you could not simply say what you meant, when every gesture, every accessory, every scent you wore was a sentence in a language only the elite could read. Welcome to Regency, England, where silence spoke louder than words. So, before we step into the candlelit ballrooms of 1815 together, I have a small request. If this story resonates with you, if you find yourself swept away by these tales from 2 centuries ago, I would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? I genuinely love hearing from you, learning about the moments when history touches your heart. Now, dim those lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Get comfortable. Let the modern world fade away for a while. Tonight, we are traveling back to an era of elegance, restriction, and the most creative rebellion you have ever encountered. Let us begin. Picture this. It is a crisp April evening in London, 1815. Napoleon has just been defeated at Waterloo, though the news has not yet reached England. The city is electric with anticipation, with possibility, with the kind of energy that comes when war finally ends and people dare to dream again. You're standing outside the most exclusive venue in all of Britain, Almack's Assembly Rooms, King Street, St. James's. If you do not understand what Almack's meant to Regency society, imagine the most exclusive club you can think of. Multiply its prestige by 10, and you are getting close. This was not just a place. It was a judgment, an approval, a key to the highest levels of society. To gain admission to Almack's required approval from the Lady Patronesses, a group of 7 aristocratic women who held more social power than most men could ever dream of wielding. They could make or break reputations with a single word. They could deny a duke's daughter entry if her dress was inappropriate or if she arrived after 11 o'clock. Yes, 11 o'clock. After that, the doors were locked, and no amount of title or wealth could get you inside. But tonight, you have a voucher. You are in. You step through those doors, and what you see takes your breath away. Hundreds of candles illuminate the room, their light reflecting off mirrors and jewellery and the glossy fabric of gowns. A small orchestra plays in the corner. The air smells of rosewater, lavender, expensive cologne, and just beneath it all the faint scent of sweat and anxiety. Because make no mistake, this is not just a party. This is a battlefield. And the weapons? They are not swords. They are gloves, fans, perfume, posture, glances, silence. You watch as a young woman enters, maybe 19 years old, her first season in society. Everything about her has been calculated. Her white muslin gown, simple but impossibly expensive, with a hem that has been weighted with lead to make it fall just right. Her hair, arranged in careful curls that took her maid 2 hours to perfect. Her kid leather gloves, so white they almost glow, fitted so perfectly that they seem like a second skin. She carries a fan painted with a pastoral scene, its ivory sticks carved by a master craftsman. But here is what you do not see at first glance. Here is what only those who know the language can read. Her gloves extend just to her wrists. This tells you she is unmarried, available. If she were married or older, they would be longer, perhaps reaching her elbows. The way she holds her fan, loosely in her left hand, slightly open, angled toward a particular gentleman across the room. The perfume she wears, light and floral, not heavy or musky. This is not random. This is intentional. This is communication. Now watch that gentleman. He notices her. Of course he does. But he cannot simply walk over and introduce himself. That would be vulgar, forward, completely inappropriate. Instead, he must navigate a complex dance of social rules that would make modern dating apps look simple by comparison. He straightens his cravat. He adjusts his gloves. He casually moves closer to someone who might introduce them, and all the while she's watching him from behind her fan, which she has now raised to cover the lower half of her face. Is she blushing? Is she smiling? He cannot tell, and that is precisely the point. This, my friends, is the world we're about to explore. A world where young women had virtually no freedom to speak their minds, to choose their own paths, to even indicate romantic interest without facing scandal. And yet, within these constraints, they developed something extraordinary. A language without words, a way of saying everything while appearing to say nothing at all. But why? Why did Regency women need these elaborate codes? To understand that, we need to understand what society expected of them. A proper young lady of the ton, that is what they called high society. The ton was meant to be demure, modest, pure, obedient, and above all, silent. She could not initiate conversations with gentlemen. She could not express romantic interest directly. She could not even choose her own husband without her father's approval. Her reputation was everything, and reputation was fragile as spun glass. One wrong word, one inappropriate gesture, and she could be ruined. Ruined. That was the actual term they used. And what did ruined mean? It meant social exile. It meant no marriage prospects. It meant shame for her entire family. It meant a life of dependence and whispered gossip. All because she laughed too loudly at a joke, or danced too many times with the same gentleman, or was seen unchaperoned for even a moment. So these young women, trapped in corsets both literal and social, did what humans have always done when faced with oppression. They got creative. If they could not speak freely, they would let their accessories speak for them. If they could not touch, then the removal of gloves would become intimate. If they could not write love letters, then the flutter of a fan would become poetry. And here is what I find most beautiful about this. The restrictions were real. The consequences were real. The fear was real. But so was the ingenuity. So was the romance. So was the rebellion, quiet as it was. These women took the very symbols of their constraint, the gloves they were required to wear, the fans they carried as decorative accessories, the perfumes that marked them as refined ladies, and they transformed them into tools of power. Think about that for a moment. In our world, we can swipe right, send a text, make our feelings known in seconds. We have so much freedom of expression that sometimes we forget how precious it is. But these women, with all their limitations, managed to create entire conversations without saying a word. They managed to court, to flirt, to accept or reject proposals, to express joy or disdain or love or hatred, all while maintaining the appearance of perfect propriety. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds exhausting. Why not just talk? And you are right. It was exhausting. But it was also their reality. And within that reality, they found moments of genuine connection. A shared glance across a ballroom, the deliberate brush of fingers when a gentleman helped a lady with her glove, the secret meaning of a particular perfume that only one person would recognize. These small rebellions, these tiny freedoms, they mattered enormously. Let me share something with you. There is a letter that Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra in 1799. Jane was at a ball, and she described watching a young woman being courted by two different men. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing here, that the young woman managed the situation with such skill, using only her fan and her gloves, that neither gentleman felt rejected, yet both understood where they stood. Jane was impressed, and Jane Austen was not easily impressed. This is the world that produced novels like Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. This is the world where every conversation was layered with subtext, where misunderstandings could derail lives, where reading people was not just a social skill, but a survival tool. And at the center of it all were three objects that every fashionable woman carried: gloves to separate her skin from the world, fans to hide her expressions and signal her intentions, and perfume to leave an impression that lingered long after she had left the room. Over the course of this journey together, we're going to unwrap each of these layers. We're going to learn how a pair of white kid leather gloves could cost more than a servant's yearly wages, and why that mattered. We're going to discover the truth behind the famous language of fans, separating historical fact from Victorian marketing myths. And we're going to inhale the scents of lavender, rose, and musk, understanding how perfume transformed from a necessity to cover body odor into an art form that expressed individual identity. But more than that, we're going to meet the people who lived this life. The dandies like Beau Brummel who revolutionized men's fashion, the powerful women like the lady patronesses who controlled access to society, the entrepreneurs like Juan Femenius Floris who built perfume empires, the ordinary young women navigating extraordinary social pressures, and yes, we're going to talk about the myths too, the romantic legends that have grown up around this era, and figure out what was real and what was wishful thinking. Because here is the thing about history. It is not just about what happened. It is about why it happened, and what it meant to the people living through it, and what it can teach us about being human. And the Regency era, for all its constraints and absurdities, has so much to teach us about resilience, creativity, and the eternal human need to connect with one another, no matter what barriers stand in the way. So now you understand the stage. You have seen the ballroom. You have felt the weight of those social rules. You've glimpsed the young woman with her gloves and her fan, trying to navigate a world that gave her so little power, yet demanded so much from her. Now, we're going to zoom in. We're going to pick up one of those accessories and examine it closely. We're going to start with the most fundamental, the most ubiquitous, the most symbolically loaded object in a Regency woman's wardrobe, the gloves. Because in the next part of our story, we're going to discover why these simple pieces of fabric held such extraordinary power, and how the act of removing them could be more intimate than a kiss. Let's talk about something most of us barely think about anymore. Gloves. When was the last time you wore a pair? Maybe in winter when your hands were freezing, maybe never. In our world, gloves are optional, practical, forgettable. But in Regency England, they were absolutely everything. They were armour. They were identity. They were the difference between respectability and scandal. And their story goes back much, much further than you might imagine. Close your eyes for a moment and picture ancient Egypt around 1400 BC. Archaeologists are carefully excavating the tomb of King Tutankhamun, brushing away sand and centuries of dust. And there, among the golden treasures and elaborate jewelry, they find something unexpected. Gloves, made of linen, beautifully crafted, meant not for warmth, but for status. The pharaohs wore gloves as symbols of wealth and power, visible proof that their hands did not need to labor. Egyptian women also wore gloves, but for a different reason entirely. They would rub expensive oils into their hands, then slip silk gloves over them overnight, letting the oils soak deep into their skin. A beauty treatment thousands of years old. Does that sound familiar? How many of us do something similar with moisturizer and cotton gloves today? But let us jump forward. Fast forward through centuries, past medieval Europe where glove makers formed their own guilds in Paris, past the Renaissance when Queen Elizabeth I wore jewelled and embroidered gloves and reportedly removed them frequently to show off her beautiful hands. Yes, even queens wanted to show off sometimes. We arrive in the 18th century, and gloves are about to become something they have never quite been before. Mandatory, ubiquitous, absolutely non-negotiable for anyone with social pretensions. Now, here is where it gets interesting. By the time the Regency era begins, around 1811, gloves have transcended their practical purpose entirely. They are no longer just about keeping hands warm or clean. They have become a social contract written in kid leather and silk, and the rules surrounding them are so complex, so specific, so absolutely bizarre by modern standards that you almost have to laugh. Except people were deadly serious about these rules. Let me introduce you to someone who took gloves very seriously indeed. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, grandmother to Queen Victoria. Charlotte was German by birth, brought to England in 1761 to marry a king she had never met. She adapted to English court life, bore 15 children, and became known for her dignity and propriety. But here is a detail that tells you everything about how people viewed gloves. Queen Charlotte kept her gloves in a perfumed box, not just any box, a specially designed, luxurious box that was scented with expensive perfumes so that every time she put on a pair of gloves, they carried that fragrance with them. Think about what that means. Gloves were not just accessories to be grabbed on your way out the door. They were treasures to be preserved, protected, perfumed. They were intimate objects. And Charlotte was not unusual in this. Wealthy women kept their gloves in special boxes, often made of wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl or painted with delicate designs. Poor women who could afford only 1 or 2 pairs would clean them painstakingly, store them carefully, and mend them when they tore, even though a properly refined lady would never wear visibly mended gloves. That was a mark of poverty, of trying too hard, of not quite belonging. But let us get to the rule that governed everything, the golden rule, if you will. One etiquette book from the 1860s, which was reflecting back on earlier decades, stated it plainly. Never go out without gloves. Put them on before you leave the house. You should no more be seen pulling on your gloves in the street than tying the strings of your bonnet. Read that again. You should no more be seen pulling on your gloves in the street than tying the strings of your bonnet. In other words, your entire appearance, every element of your outfit should be complete before you stepped outside your door. To adjust your gloves in public, to button them while walking down the street, suggested that you were disorganized, lower class, lacking in breeding. It sounds absurd, does it not? But imagine living in a world where everyone is watching, everyone is judging, and the smallest slip could affect your marriage prospects, your social invitations, your entire future. So what did this mean practically? It meant that every time a woman left her house, whether for a 15-minute walk to a neighbour's home or an evening at the theatre, she engaged in a ritual. She would sit at her dressing table, her maid beside her, and carefully pull on her gloves. If they were the tight-fitting kid leather variety, this could take several minutes. The leather had to be worked over each finger, smoothed along the hand, buttoned precisely. Some gloves had a dozen tiny buttons running up the wrist or forearm. Can you imagine buttoning a dozen tiny buttons every single time you wanted to leave your house, and then doing it again when you got home? But here is what I find fascinating. The act of putting on gloves was private, but the act of removing them, that could be incredibly public and incredibly meaningful. Let me walk you through some scenarios, and you will begin to see why gloves held such power. Scenario 1. You're a gentleman calling on a friend at his home. You arrive at the door wearing your gloves as is proper. The butler shows you into the drawing room. Now, what do? According to the rules, you should remove the glove from your right hand before shaking your friend's hand. To offer a gloved hand to an ungloved person was considered insulting, suggesting you did not want direct contact with them. But here is the catch. If you are a lady receiving visitors, you keep your gloves on. Always. Unless you are offered food or drink, in which case you must remove them to eat, but you do so discreetly, laying them in your lap with your napkin placed over them. Why? Because eating with gloves on was considered disgusting, crude, vulgar. Even though period dramas constantly show women eating and drinking with gloves on, it was absolutely not done in real life. The gloves would be ruined, and more than that, it was simply gross. Scenario 2. You're at a ball, dancing. This is where the rules get really specific. Both men and women kept their gloves on while dancing. Always. The thought of touching someone's bare hand while dancing was far too intimate. It would be like slow dancing with someone while both of you were completely naked by Regency standards. Shocking. Unthinkable. So everyone danced in gloves, which meant that the gloves had to be pristine white and perfectly fitted. Any stain, any wear, any looseness would be immediately visible to everyone watching, and make no mistake, everyone was watching. Scenario 3, and this is where it gets romantic. A gentleman is courting a lady. They have been properly introduced, have danced a few times, have had chaperoned conversations. He is falling in love with her. She might be falling in love with him. But they cannot hold hands. They cannot touch skin to skin, not until they are engaged at the very earliest, and even then, rarely. So what happens? Let me tell you about a practice that was considered deeply intimate. A gentleman would help a lady remove her gloves. Picture it. They are sitting together, perhaps in a drawing room after a ball, perhaps in a garden during an approved outing, but always with a chaperone nearby. The lady extends her hand. The gentleman gently grasps her glove at the fingertips and slowly, carefully pulls it off. It was one of the few times they were allowed to touch, even if only through fabric initially. And then, for just a moment, her bare hand would be visible. He might, if he was very bold, and if they were very nearly engaged, brush his fingers against hers, just for a second, just enough to feel her skin. And that tiny touch, that momentary contact, carried more electric charge than a passionate kiss would in our modern world. One writer from the Victorian era, looking back on this practice, described it as an erotic and physical stand-in for the act of sex itself. Now, that might sound like an exaggeration to us, but think about it from their perspective. These were people who lived covered from neck to ankle, who were never alone with the opposite sex, who were taught that physical desire was shameful. A bare hand was genuinely intimate. The inside of a wrist where the glove ended and skin began was considered an erogenous zone. Seriously, a visible wrist was slightly scandalous. Now let us talk about the differences between men's and women's glove etiquette, because they were not quite the same. For women, as we have discussed, gloves were nearly always required outside the home, but for men, the rules were more flexible and, frankly, more confusing. Men were advised that when going places where they were likely to meet people, it was well to have the glove of your right hand off. Wait, what? So men would walk around with one glove on and one glove off? Well, yes and no. If you were in a situation where you would be shaking many hands like a receiving line or a business meeting, it made sense to hold your right glove in your left hand keeping your right hand bare and ready for greeting. But walking down the street with one glove on and one glove off, that would have looked ridiculous, and Regency men were very concerned with not looking ridiculous. Here is another rule for men. When entering someone's home, a gentleman was expected to remove his hat, gloves, overcoat and cane in the entrance hall. All of these items would be handed to a servant. But if a gentleman was receiving guests in his own home, he should not be wearing gloves at all, unless he happened to be dressed to go out when they called, in which case his gloved hands would signal to his visitors that he was about to leave and could not stay long. See? Even the presence or absence of gloves communicated information without a single word being spoken. And temperature mattered too. One etiquette book advised that it was much better to offer a covered hand than to offend a lady's touch by offering a cold hand. So if a gentleman's hands were cold, he was actually encouraged to keep his gloves on when greeting a lady, to spare her the unpleasant sensation of cold skin. Can you imagine? We worry about having fresh breath or clean clothes. They worried about whether their hand temperature might offend someone. Let me share with you what a typical day with gloves might have looked like for a young woman of the upper classes. Let us call her Eleanor, and let us say it is 1815, the same year as our ball at Almack's. Eleanor wakes around 9 in the morning. Her maid helps her dress in a simple morning gown. She goes downstairs for breakfast with her family, gloveless because she's at home. After breakfast, she plans to walk to her friend's house 3 streets away for a morning visit. Before leaving, she sits at her dressing table. Her maid brings out a pair of short, wrist-length gloves made of cotton. Not her finest gloves, these are for walking. The maid helps her pull them on, buttoning the small buttons at the wrist. Eleanor checks her appearance in the mirror. Hair neat? Check. Bonnet tied? Check. Gloves clean and properly fitted? Check. She is ready. She walks to her friend's house, is shown into the drawing room and spends an hour chatting. She keeps her gloves on the entire time, even when offered tea and biscuits, which she politely declines because eating would require removing the gloves, and that feels too familiar for a morning call. When she returns home, she removes the gloves immediately and hands them to her maid, who will brush them clean and store them. That afternoon, Eleanor is going shopping with her mother. She puts on a different pair of gloves, these made of fine kid leather, light grey in colour to match her walking dress. At the shops, she keeps her gloves on while examining fabrics and ribbons. She makes her purchases, returns home, removes these gloves as well. That evening, Eleanor is attending a private ball. This is the big event, the one that requires her finest appearance. She puts on a beautiful gown, and her maid brings out the opera gloves, long white kid leather gloves that reach past her elbows. These cost more than the maid earns in 3 months. They fit so tightly that Eleanor can barely bend her fingers. She will keep these gloves on all evening, even while dancing, even when her hands grow hot and damp inside them. Only when supper is served will she carefully remove them, laying them in her lap. After supper, she will put them back on. When she finally returns home near midnight, her hands will be stiff and sore, and the gloves will need to be carefully cleaned because sweat and heat have marked them. 4 different pairs of gloves, 4 different contexts, and Eleanor is not unusual. A fashionable woman might change her gloves 6 or 7 times in a single day. The cost was enormous. A really fine pair of kid leather gloves could cost several pounds, and remember, this is at a time when a housemaid might earn £10 for an entire year of work. A woman who wanted to be truly fashionable needed dozens of pairs. White for evening, coloured for day, heavier ones for winter, lighter ones for summer, riding gloves with gauntlet cuffs, short gloves for morning, long gloves for balls, and God forbid you showed up with the wrong gloves for the occasion. wearing short gloves to a formal ball, social death, wearing white gloves during the day, trying too hard, wearing gloves with visible darning or stains, proof that you could not afford new ones, which meant you probably could not afford to be in society at all. But here is what moves me about all of this. Despite the absurdity, despite the expense, despite the discomfort and the restrictions, gloves became beautiful. Glove makers were artists. They created gloves embroidered with tiny flowers, gloves with lace inserts, gloves dyed in subtle shades of lavender and sage and rose. They invented new techniques for tanning leather to make it softer, more supple. They competed to create the perfect fit, the perfect colour, the perfect style. And women, trapped in a system that gave them so little control, found ways to express themselves through these tiny choices. The shade of grey she chose, the placement of the buttons, the quality of the stitching, these were the ways she could say, "I am here, I have taste, I matter." So yes, gloves were about propriety and social control, but they were also about beauty and self-expression, and the human need to be seen, really seen, even in a world that demanded conformity. And as we move forward in this story, you are going to discover that this pattern repeats itself with fans and with perfume as well. Each restriction birthing its own form of rebellion, each rule creating space for creativity. Because that is what humans do. We adapt. We find ways to be ourselves even when the world tells us we cannot be. But gloves were just the beginning. We've talked about materials and rules and daily rituals. Now we need to go deeper. We need to understand exactly what kind of glove a woman wore and why that mattered. Because the length, the colour, the material, each detail told a story about who she was and what she wanted others to know about her. And some of those stories might surprise you. If I handed you 2 pairs of gloves right now, both white, both elegant, both seemingly identical, could you tell me which one cost 3 times more than the other? Could you identify which material came from where, or what made one pair suitable for a duchess and the other barely acceptable for a country squire's daughter? In Regency England, everyone could. Because gloves were not just gloves. They were resumes written in leather and silk. They were tax returns displayed on your hands. They were announcements of who you were, where you came from, and who you hope to become. Let us start with the material that dominated everything: kid leather. You've probably heard this term before, maybe seen it on expensive bags or shoes today. But do you actually know what kid leather is? It is leather made from the skin of young goats, specifically goats less than a year old. Why young goats? Because their skin is incredibly soft, supple, and fine-grained. It can be dyed easily, stretches beautifully, and when properly tanned feels like butter against your skin. The very best kid leather came from specific regions, particularly France and Spain, where craftsmen had perfected tanning techniques over centuries. Here is something that will surprise you. A pair of really fine kid leather gloves for a woman was not sewn together like we might imagine. The best gloves were cut from a single piece of leather with almost no seams. The glove maker would carefully select the hide, examining it for any imperfections, any scars, any unevenness. Then, with incredible precision, they would cut the pattern so that each finger, each curve of the hand came from that one piece. The thumb might have a tiny seam, but that was all. This required extraordinary skill because leather is not forgiving. One wrong cut and the entire piece was ruined. And the fitting? Oh, the fitting was an art form. The finest gloves fit so tightly that they looked painted on. Women would soak their hands in almond oil before pulling on new kid leather gloves, working the leather over each finger millimetre by millimetre. Some women used glove stretchers, wooden forms shaped like hands to break in new gloves before wearing them. Others simply endured the pain of forcing their hands into leather that felt a size too small, knowing that it would eventually mold to their exact shape. And once kid leather gloves were properly broken in, they fit so perfectly that you could see the outline of every knuckle, every tendon. That perfection was the entire point. Now, how much did these gloves cost? Hold on to your hats for this. A really exceptional pair of French kid leather opera gloves, the long ones that reached past the elbow, could cost anywhere from £2 to £5 in 1815. To put that in perspective, a housemaid earned about £10 to £12 per year. A governess, who was considered slightly higher in status, might earn £20 to £30 annually. So a single pair of gloves represented weeks of wages for most people. And remember, a fashionable woman needed multiple pairs. Dozens of pairs. She could not wear the same gloves every day. They would wear out, get stained, lose their shape. Some historians estimate that a wealthy woman might spend £50 to £100 per year on gloves alone. That is more than most families earned in total. This was not just fashion. This was wealth display. This was saying, without words, I can afford to wrap my hands in young goat skin multiple times per day, every single day, and never worry about the cost. But not everyone could afford kid leather. So what did other people wear? Cotton gloves were the everyday alternative. They were washable, which was a huge advantage, and much less expensive. A pair of cotton gloves might cost a few shillings instead of pounds. Middle-class women wore cotton gloves for morning visits and shopping, saving their 1 or 2 pairs of kid leather gloves for special occasions. Working-class women who wanted to appear genteel might own a single pair of cotton gloves, carefully washed and mended, worn only on Sundays or for important events. Then there was silk. Silk gloves occupied an interesting middle ground. They were more expensive than cotton, but less expensive than kid leather. However, and this is crucial, silk gloves were considered slightly tacky by the 1890s. One etiquette writer sniffed that silk gloves have long ceased to be fashionable. But during the earlier part of the century, the Regency period we're discussing, silk gloves were acceptable for certain occasions, particularly in summer when kid leather felt too heavy and hot. Here is what fascinates me about all this. People could tell the difference. They could look at your gloves from across a room and know what they were made of. Kid leather had a certain matte finish, a particular way of catching the light. Cotton looked duller, less refined. Silk had a slight sheen, and cheap cotton trying to pass as kid leather. Everyone could spot that immediately. It was like showing up to a gala in a dress from a discount store and hoping no one would notice. They noticed. They always noticed. Now let us talk about length, because this is where things get really specific. The length of your gloves told people an enormous amount about you, your status, your intentions, and the formality of the occasion. Think of glove length like a volume dial on social formality. The longer the glove, the more formal the occasion, and interestingly, the higher your status or the more you wanted to project high status. For daytime wear, for morning visits and shopping and walking in the park, women wore short gloves. These typically ended at the wrist or just barely past it. They might have 2 or 3 buttons at the wrist. These were practical gloves, meant to protect the hands without being cumbersome. Young unmarried women almost always wore short gloves during the day, unless they were in deep mourning or winter cold required something longer. For more formal daytime events, perhaps a garden party or an afternoon tea, gloves might extend a few inches past the wrist. Not quite to the elbow, but definitely covering part of the forearm. These usually had more buttons, maybe 6 or 8 running up the arm. The more buttons, the fancier the occasion. It was a sliding scale of formality measured in inches and fastenings. But for evening, for balls and opera and formal dinners, that is when the opera gloves came out. And let me tell you, opera gloves were something else entirely. They extended well past the elbow, sometimes almost to the shoulder. 16 buttons or more running up the arm. Some gloves had so many buttons that it took 2 people to fasten them, the lady and her maid working together to secure each tiny button into its loop. And these gloves had to be white. Not cream, not ivory. White. Absolutely pristine white. Do you want to know something that seems almost impossible? Women danced in these gloves. Can you imagine? Your arms are encased in tight leather from fingertip to upper arm. You can barely bend your elbows. Your hands are starting to sweat, and you have to execute complicated dance steps while maintaining perfect posture and a pleasant expression. I get uncomfortable wearing Spanx for a few hours. These women wore what were essentially arm Spanx for entire evenings and made it look effortless. But here is the secret meaning behind the lengths. Short gloves on a young woman signaled availability, youth, the daytime world of calling cards and careful courtship. Long gloves signaled the evening world, the adult world of serious marriage negotiations and wealth display. But long gloves during the day, that could mean a few different things. Either you were in mourning and covering your arms completely was part of that somber respectability, or you were older and covering arms that were no longer youthful, or you were simply cold. Context mattered enormously. Now, about colour. We have talked about white being required for formal evening wear. But during the day, women had options, and those options said things about them. White or pale gloves during the day suggested you did not need to worry about dirt, that you had servants to clean them or money to replace them frequently. Coloured gloves, on the other hand, were practical and fashionable. Pale grey was enormously popular. So was a colour they called fawn, which was a sort of light brown. Lavender for half-mourning. Darker browns and greens for autumn and winter. But there was an art to choosing colours. One etiquette manual advised that a glove of the same colour as the sleeve makes the arm look longer. A contrasting glove seems to shorten it. So women were thinking about proportions, about how their glove colour would affect their entire silhouette. If you wanted to look taller and more elegant, you matched. If you wanted to draw attention to your small hands or delicate wrists, you contrasted. Black gloves occupied a special category. They were always acceptable, always appropriate, always elegant. They suggested sophistication and maturity. Young debutantes in their first season rarely wore black gloves unless in mourning. Black was for women who'd been married, for widows, for women of a certain age and status who no longer needed to prove their innocence and purity through white kid leather. And speaking of proving things, let me tell you about the most obsessed glove wearer in all of Regency history, George Brian Brummel, known to everyone as Beau Brummel. We met him briefly before, but now we need to understand his glove mythology. Beau Brummel was not born into aristocracy. His father was a government secretary, respectable but not noble. Yet Brummel managed to become the single most influential arbiter of men's fashion in London, a close friend of the Prince Regent himself, and a legend that persists to this day. How did he do it? Partly through genuine charisma and wit, but mostly through being absolutely obsessively meticulous about his appearance. And nowhere was this more evident than in his gloves. There is a famous story about Brummel, probably exaggerated but based on truth, that appears in an 1828 novel called Pelham. In the novel, a character based on Brummel boasts that he employs 3 different craftsmen to make his gloves. One for the hand, one for the fingers, and one for the thumb. 3 craftsmen for gloves. Now, This was almost certainly satire, poking fun at Brummel's excessive fastidiousness. But the fact that people believed he might actually do this tells you everything about his reputation. Brummel was famous for taking hours to dress, for his uncompromising standards, for his belief that a gentleman's appearance should be so perfect that it attracted no attention at all. Paradoxically, his perfection made him the most noticed man in London. And here is the thing. Brummel's influence was so enormous that men across England started copying him. They wanted gloves that fit as perfectly as his did. They wanted the exact shade of pale buff that he favoured for daytime wear. They wanted to project that same air of effortless superiority. And so the glove makers got better and better. The standards got higher and higher, and the amount of time and money men spent on gloves increased dramatically. But Brummel's story does not end happily. His gambling debts caught up with him. He quarrelled with the Prince Regent, calling him "your fat friend" in a moment of spectacularly bad judgment, and by 1816 he had to flee England to escape debtor's prison. He died in France in 1840, penniless and suffering from neurosyphilis, in a charity asylum. The man who had defined elegance for an entire generation died in absolute poverty. It is heartbreaking, really. But his influence on fashion lasted long after his death. The tailored, understated, perfectly fitted style he championed, that became the foundation for modern menswear. Every man who puts on a well-fitted suit today is, in some small way, wearing Brummel's legacy. Now, I need to talk about something that drives historians absolutely crazy. The way gloves are depicted in period dramas. You know what I am talking about if you've ever watched a Regency or Victorian drama. The beautiful actresses in their elaborate gowns sitting at tea, daintily holding teacups while wearing their gloves. Or worse, picking up food with gloved hands, bringing it to their mouths. Every historian watching is screaming at the screen, "No, no, that is not how it worked." As we discussed, eating with gloves on was considered disgusting. The gloves would be ruined by food stains, and more importantly, it was simply not done. Yet filmmakers love showing it because it looks elegant and refined to modern eyes. We associate gloves with formality, so we assume more gloves equals more formal equals more proper. But that is not how Regency people thought about it. To them, eating with gloves on suggested you were either ignorant of proper manners or too poor to own enough gloves to risk staining them. Here is another Hollywood mistake. The way actresses casually pull on gloves as they walk out a door, or tug them off with one smooth motion. In reality, getting into tight kid leather gloves was a process. It took time. It sometimes took help, and removing them. You did not yank them off. You carefully unbuttoned each button, then gently eased each finger out, then the thumb, then the rest of the hand. Tugging could tear the leather or damage the stitching, and damaged gloves were expensive problems. So what did it actually take to maintain these gloves? Let us talk about the reality of glove care, because it was essentially a part-time job. Kid leather gloves could not be washed with water. Water would stiffen the leather, discolour it, ruin the fit. So how did you clean them? Very, very carefully. There were various methods. Some people used breadcrumbs, rubbing slightly stale bread over the leather to absorb dirt and oils. Others used special glove cleaning powders made from chalk and other ingredients. Still others sent their gloves to professional cleaners who had secret techniques for refreshing leather without damaging it. Between wearings, gloves needed to be stored properly. They couldn't be folded or crumpled. The finest gloves were laid flat in those scented boxes we mentioned, often with tissue paper between them. Some women used glove stretchers, those wooden hand forms, to keep gloves from shrinking or losing their shape. And gloves had to be kept away from light, which could fade them, and away from damp which could cause mildew. If a button came off, it had to be reattached perfectly. If a seam started to split, it needed immediate mending by someone who knew what they were doing. If a glove got stained, you had a limited time to address it before the stain set permanently. Caring for a wardrobe of gloves was genuinely labor-intensive. This is why wealthy women had ladies' maids whose duties included glove care. It was not just a luxury, it was a necessity if you wanted to maintain the appearance that society demanded. Let me give you one final detail that encapsulates everything we've been talking about. In some households, there were glove books. These were ledgers where the lady of the house or her maid would record every pair of gloves in her possession. The date purchased, the cost, the colour, the material, where they were worn, when they needed cleaning, when they were retired from use. Some women kept these records for years, tracking dozens or even hundreds of pairs of gloves over time. Why would anyone do this? Because gloves were investments. They were assets. They were too expensive to lose track of, too important to mismanage. A woman's glove collection represented a significant portion of her clothing budget and her social capital. Keeping careful records made sense in a world where a single lost glove could be a genuine financial setback. So now you understand. Gloves were not simple accessories. They were complex markers of identity, wealth, occasion, and intention. The material told your financial story. The length told your social story. The colour told your fashion story. And the condition told your character story. Were they pristine? You were careful, well organised, properly funded. Were they slightly worn but well maintained? You were respectable but not wealthy. Were they stained or poorly fitted? You were trying too hard or not trying enough, and either way you did not quite belong. But we've been focused on the technical details, the materials and measurements and meanings. We've not yet talked about what happened when those gloves came into play in actual social situations, what it meant when they were removed, when they were offered, when they were refused. And that is where the real drama unfolds, in the moments when gloves became part of the dance of courtship, the rituals of dining, and the unspoken negotiations of Regency social life. So let us step back into that ballroom, back into that dining room, and watch what happens when gloves meet real human desire and real social pressure. There is a moment, frozen in time, that I want you to imagine with me. A candlelit dining room in Mayfair, London, 1814. 20 guests are seated around an enormous mahogany table, laden with silver and crystal. The first course has just been served, a delicate soup in fine porcelain bowls, and every single woman at that table is about to perform the same choreographed movement, a ritual so ingrained that they do it without thinking. They're going to remove their gloves. Watch how they do it. No one yanks. No one rushes. Each woman carefully unbuttons her gloves, starting at the wrist, working her way down. She slides the glove off one finger at a time, never pulling, always easing. She folds both gloves neatly, places them in her lap, then drapes her napkin over them. The gloves essentially disappear. They are hidden, protected, kept clean. And only then, only after this small ceremony is complete, does she pick up her spoon. Why am I dwelling on this moment? Because it represents something profound about the Regency world. The removal of gloves was not casual. It was a transition. It was moving from the public self to something slightly more private, even at a dinner party surrounded by people. Those gloves were armour, and taking them off meant becoming momentarily vulnerable. Your hands, your actual skin was now visible. You were slightly more yourself, slightly more real. Now, imagine you are a gentleman at this same dinner. You've also removed your gloves before sitting down, but your process was different. You probably removed them in the entrance hall, handing them to a servant along with your hat and coat. You would never have worn them to the table. For men, gloves at a formal dinner suggested you were about to leave, that you considered yourself above the company, or worse, that you did not understand proper etiquette. So you arrive at the table with bare hands and you wait while the ladies perform their glove removal ritual, and you absolutely do not stare while they do it, even though exposed female hands are oddly fascinating in a world where hands are usually covered. Here is something that happened, documented in multiple etiquette books of the era. At a formal dinner in the early 1800s, a young woman, newly arrived in London society from the countryside, did not remove her gloves before eating. No one said anything. British politeness dictated that you never directly correct someone's breach of etiquette in public. But the whispers started immediately. By the next day, every drawing room in Mayfair knew about the girl who ate soup with her gloves on. She was never invited to that house again. One mistake, one moment of not knowing the rules, and her social standing took a hit from which it took months to recover. Was this fair? Of course not. Was it ridiculous? Absolutely, but it was real. The rules about gloves were not suggestions. They were gates, and if you did not know how to open them correctly, you found yourself locked out. Let me tell you about the finger bowls, because this is a detail that often gets left out of the pretty picture. At formal dinners, after the main courses but before dessert, servants would bring around small bowls of water, usually with a slice of lemon or a rose petal floating in them. These were finger bowls, and their purpose was simple: to clean your hands so you could put your gloves back on. Because here is what no one likes to acknowledge. People ate with their hands much more than we do now. Yes, there were forks and knives, but many foods were still picked up directly. Fruit, certain breads, even some meats. Your hands got dirty, greasy, sticky, and you needed to clean them before you could touch your expensive gloves again. So you dipped your fingers in the finger bowl, dried them on your napkin, and then, discreetly, under the table if possible, you put your gloves back on. Some women became so practiced at this that they could re-glove themselves without anyone noticing. Others fumbled with the buttons and everyone politely pretended not to see. Now, have you ever been at a fancy dinner and not known which fork to use and felt that spike of anxiety? Multiply that by 100, and you have some sense of what Regency women felt about glove etiquette. Because the stakes were so much higher. Using the wrong fork makes you look unsophisticated for a moment. Mishandling your gloves could ruin your marriage prospects. But dining was actually the simpler scenario. You knew what to do. Gloves off for eating, gloves on for everything else. Dancing, though. Dancing was where things got complicated, beautiful, and deeply symbolic all at once. Think about what dancing meant in Regency England. It was not just entertainment, it was courtship. It was one of the very few times a young man and woman could touch each other, could speak to each other relatively privately, could spend extended time together. A ball was not really about dancing, it was about making matches. And the gloves? They were crucial to the entire ritual. Both partners danced with gloves on, always. This was non-negotiable. The thought of touching someone's bare hand while dancing was shockingly intimate. It would be like slow dancing with someone while both of you were in your underwear by their standards. You simply did not do it. So everyone danced gloved, which meant your gloves had to be perfect. Imagine you are a young woman at a ball. You've been asked to dance by a gentleman you find attractive. This is your moment. You place your gloved hand in his gloved hand for the figures of the dance. You can feel the warmth of his palm through 2 layers of kid leather. You can feel the slight pressure when he guides you through a turn. But you cannot feel his actual skin. There is always that barrier, and somehow that barrier makes everything more charged, more electric. Because you are aware of what you are not feeling. You're aware that those few millimeters of leather are all that separate your skin from his, and that awareness is its own kind of intimacy. There is a reason Jane Austen wrote so many scenes of dancing in her novels. She understood that dancing was where everything happened, where Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy had their first real conversation, where Emma Woodhouse realised her feelings for Mr. Knightley, where Fanny Price watched the man she loved dance with someone else. Dancing was the acceptable form of courtship, and gloves made it safe, proper, and paradoxically far more romantic than if everyone had been touching skin to skin. But here is what I find most fascinating. Because dancing in gloves was required, the quality of your gloves became incredibly important. If your gloves were too loose, they would slip and bunch during the dance, making it awkward and ungraceful. If they were too tight, your hands would sweat and the leather would become damp, which was both uncomfortable and embarrassing. If they were stained or worn, everyone in the ballroom could see and they would judge you for it. So women saved their very best gloves for balls. Those pristine white opera gloves we talked about earlier, those were dancing gloves, and if you attended balls regularly, you went through gloves at an alarming rate. One source I found from the era suggested that an active debutante attending 2 or 3 balls per week during the London season might go through 20 to 30 pairs of white gloves in a few months. 20 to 30 pairs. At £2 to £5 per pair, you do the mathematics. That is £60 to £150, just on gloves for dancing, just for a few months. A working-class family could live on that for a year or more. Now, I want to tell you about a specific moment that was considered almost unbearably romantic in Regency terms. The moment when a gentleman helped a lady remove her gloves. Let me set the scene for you properly, because context is everything. A young couple has been properly introduced. They have danced together twice, which is the maximum allowed without raising eyebrows and starting rumours. They have had chaperoned conversations. He is called at her home, bringing his sister or mother to make it proper. They are courting in the official Regency sense, which means everyone knows he is interested and she has not discouraged him. They are not yet engaged, but it seems to be heading that direction. They are in the drawing room of her family home. Her mother is sitting across the room doing needlework, technically chaperoning but not hovering. This is a good sign. It means her mother approves enough to give them some illusion of privacy. They have been talking for perhaps 20 minutes, and then he does something that makes her heart race. He reaches out and takes her hand, still gloved of course, but then slowly, carefully, he begins to remove her glove. He does not ask permission. In their world, asking would be vulgar, would break the spell. Instead, he just does it, gently, his eyes on hers the whole time. He grasps the tip of each finger and eases the leather back, the thumb, the palm, the wrist. He works the glove down until her hand is bare. And for a moment, just a moment, he holds her naked hand in his still gloved one. Maybe he brushes his thumb across her knuckles. Maybe he just holds it, marvelling at the softness of her skin, the warmth of her palm. This moment, this gesture, was intensely meaningful. It was a promise. It was saying, I want to know you without barriers. I want to touch your real self, not just your protected public self. It was as close to a declaration of serious intent as you could get without actually proposing. And her allowing it, her not pulling away, was her answer. Yes, you may. Yes, I want that too. Yes, we're moving towards something permanent. Do you see why one Victorian writer called this an erotic stand-in for the act of sex itself. In a world where physical contact was so strictly regulated, where even married couples rarely showed affection in public, this moment of glove removal was profoundly sensual. It was anticipation. It was revelation. It was the promise of future intimacy wrapped up in a simple gesture. But of course, not every glove removal went smoothly. Let me tell you about the disasters, because they happened, and they were mortifying. Imagine a gentleman, nervous, trying to impress a young lady attempting this romantic gesture, but he is not practiced, or the gloves are particularly tight, or his hands are shaking slightly. He pulls too hard. The glove does not slide off gracefully, it catches. He tugs harder, the seam splits. Or worse, one of the fingers turns inside out. Or even worse, the whole glove comes off in a sudden jerk and he stumbles backward slightly from the force. The romance is thoroughly ruined. The lady is trying not to laugh or cry, depending on how expensive the gloves were. The chaperone is pretending not to have noticed, and the gentleman wants the floor to open and swallow him whole. These moments happened. Not often, because most men learned early to handle gloves carefully, but they happened. And when they did, the gentleman usually had to purchase the lady a new pair of gloves, which was both a financial hit and a reminder of his awkwardness. Now, let me share something directly from Jane Austen, because she wrote about gloves more than you might expect. In a letter to her sister Cassandra, written in 1798, Jane described a shopping trip where she purchased gloves. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing slightly, that she had bought gloves at a particular shop and was very pleased with the price and quality, but she worried they might be too long in the fingers. She asked Cassandra's advice about whether to keep them or exchange them. This might seem trivial to us. Who cares if glove fingers are slightly too long? But to Jane, it mattered. It mattered because poorly fitting gloves marked you as someone who did not have the money for proper tailoring, or who did not understand the importance of perfect fit. Jane Austen, one of the greatest writers in English history, worried about whether her glove fingers were the right length. That tells you everything about how seriously these details were taken. In another letter, Jane mentioned watching a young woman at a ball who kept adjusting her gloves, pulling them up, smoothing them down. Jane noted, with her characteristic gentle mockery, that the woman was clearly uncomfortable and probably wearing gloves that did not fit properly. The implication was clear. This woman was trying to appear more fashionable than her budget allowed. She had bought gloves that looked good but did not fit well, and everyone at the ball could tell. Jane Austen noticed everything, and she understood that gloves were never just gloves. They were storytelling devices. They were character reveals. They were class markers and courtship tools and social weapons, all wrapped up in kid leather and silk. But what about the flirting? You have probably heard that Victorians who came after the Regency used gloves to flirt. There were supposedly all these gestures, these signals. Twirling your glove meant one thing, dropping it meant another. Biting the tip of your finger through the glove meant something else entirely. And yes, that did develop, but mostly in the Victorian era, the 1840s through 1890s. During the Regency itself, not so much. Regency women were expected to be demure, modest, pure. Overt flirtation was scandalous. If a young unmarried woman was caught deliberately flirting, she risked her reputation. So while later Victorian women might play with their gloves as a form of communication, Regency women were much more careful. They might fan themselves in certain ways, which we will talk about soon, or they might use their eyes and their posture, but obvious glove flirtation. That was more likely to be done by married women, widows, or women of questionable reputation, the kind of women Jane Austen called birds of paradise in her novels. the ones who are not bound by quite the same rules as innocent debutantes. This is where historical accuracy and popular imagination diverge. We want to believe in elaborate coded languages, in secret signals and clever rebellions, and there were some, but mostly Regency women worked within the system, not against it. They found tiny ways to express themselves, tiny moments of genuine connection, but they did not openly defy the rules. The stakes were too high. Let me tell you about one more scenario, one that happened at every ball, every dinner party, every social gathering. The moment when a gentleman offered to retrieve a lady's gloves. Maybe she had left them in another room. Maybe they had fallen. Maybe she simply mentioned needing them, and he would say, "May I fetch them for you?" And she would say, "If it is not too much trouble," and he would go. This sounds like nothing, right? Just basic politeness. But watch what it actually meant. He was touching her gloves. He was holding something that had touched her skin, that held the shape of her hands, that probably carried a faint trace of her perfume. In a world where you could not hold hands, where you could not exchange tokens of affection openly, carrying a lady's gloves was surprisingly intimate. It was trusted. It was care. It was attention. And when he brought them back, she would take them from him. Their fingers might brush just for a second. And that second mattered. That second was sometimes all you got. I think about this often, how much meaning they found in such small gestures. We live in a world where we can text someone we like at any hour, where we can send photos and videos and constant updates about our feelings. We have so much freedom to express affection, and yet, sometimes I wonder if we have lost something too. If in gaining the freedom to say and do anything, we have lost the poetry of restraint, the anticipation, the way a single touch could mean everything because it was so rare. I am not romanticizing their world. I would not want to live under those restrictions. But I do think there is something beautiful about how much they made of what little they had, how they transformed gloves into love letters, how they found intimacy in the space between fabric and skin. And gloves were just one part of the language, just one tool in their arsenal of silent communication. Because as we step away from the dinner table, as we leave the ballroom floor, we're about to encounter another accessory that was even more versatile, even more layered with meaning. Something that could hide your face or reveal your feelings, could cool you down or heat things up, could be a toy or a weapon or a work of art. Let us turn our attention now to the fan and to the myths and truths that surround it. Hold a fan in your mind for a moment, not the electric kind that sits in your window, not even the paper folding fans you might buy at a summer festival. I want you to imagine something else entirely, a work of art small enough to fit in your hand. Ivory sticks carved so delicately they look like lace, silk or paper stretched between them, painted by an artist whose name might be forgotten, but whose skill was undeniable. Gold leaf catching the candlelight, tiny scenes of gods and goddesses, or pastoral landscapes, or even current events, all contained in an object that weighs almost nothing and costs more than some people earned in a year. This is what a Regency fan was. This is what we need to understand before we can talk about what it meant. The story of the fan begins impossibly long ago. Ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient India, civilizations separated by thousands of miles, all independently creating the same basic tool. Something to move air, something to create a breeze when the heat became unbearable. The earliest fans were probably large palm leaves or woven reeds, held by servants who would stand behind royalty and wave these massive fans to keep them cool. In ancient Egypt, fans made of ostrich feathers mounted on long poles were symbols of power. Only pharaohs and high priests could have them. The fan meant you were important enough to have someone else manage your comfort. In China, fans evolved into art forms. By the 2nd century, Chinese craftsmen were creating folding fans with bamboo ribs and paper or silk stretched between them. These fans often featured calligraphy and paintings, sometimes by famous artists. A fan could be a gift that carried immense meaning, the painting on it telling a story or conveying a message. In Japan, fans became part of theatrical performances, part of ceremonies, part of daily life at every level of society. But when did fans arrive in Europe? That is a journey in itself. Fans came to Europe through trade routes, through explorers and merchants bringing back treasures from the East. By the 1500s, fans were becoming fashionable accessories among European aristocracy. Catherine de' Medici, that powerful Italian woman who became Queen of France, is often credited with popularizing fans at the French court in the mid-1500s, and where France led, the rest of Europe followed. By the 1600s, fans were everywhere in wealthy European society, but they were not yet the delicate folding fans we think of. Many were fixed fans, meaning they did not fold. They were rigid circles or ovals of fabric or feathers or even ivory, mounted on a handle. You held them up and waved them. They were awkward, honestly. Hard to carry, hard to store. But they were beautiful, and beauty mattered more than convenience. The folding fan, the kind we associate with the Regency era, became popular in Europe in the 1600s, and here is where things get interesting. Because fans became an industry. Fan making became a respected craft, a guild profession. In London, the Worshipful Company of Fan Makers was established in 1709. Yes, fan makers had their own official guild, with standards and apprenticeships and regulations. This was serious business. Let me walk you through how a truly fine fan was made, because the process was extraordinary. First, you needed the sticks. These were the rigid supports, usually between 10 and 20 of them, that formed the structure of the fan. The very finest fans had sticks made of ivory, but not just any ivory. The best came from elephant tusks, specifically the dense center portion. This ivory could be carved incredibly thin without breaking. A master carver would take a piece of ivory and cut it into long, thin strips. Then comes the magic. He would carve these strips with designs, flowers, leaves, geometric patterns, sometimes entire scenes with figures and buildings, all carved into pieces of ivory barely thicker than a credit card. How did they do this without modern tools? Patience. Incredible patience. A single carved ivory stick might take days to complete. The carver would use tiny chisels, files, and drills. He would work by natural light because candlelight was not bright enough for this detail. His eyes would strain, his hands would cramp. But the result was something that looked impossible. Lace made of solid ivory, architecture rendered in bone. But ivory was expensive, so there were alternatives. Mother of pearl was popular and produced a beautiful iridescent effect. Tortoiseshell, which came from sea turtles, could be heated and moulded into shapes, then polished to a warm glow. Wood, particularly sandalwood or boxwood, was more affordable but still could be carved beautifully. And for those with modest budgets, painted or lacquered wooden sticks could look quite elegant from a distance. Once the sticks were ready, they needed to be assembled. This required precision. Each stick had to be mounted on 2 pivot points, usually rivets made of metal, sometimes gold or silver for the finest fans. The sticks had to be spaced perfectly so the fan would open smoothly to a full semicircle and close flat. If the spacing was off even slightly, the fan would be awkward to use, and no fashionable woman wanted an awkward fan. Then came the leaf, the material stretched between the sticks. For expensive fans, this was silk. For moderately priced fans, it might be paper, but fine paper made from linen fibres, not the rough stuff. The leaf had to be cut precisely to match the curve of the fully opened fan. It had to be attached to the sticks in a way that allowed flexibility but also strength. Glue was used, sometimes stitching for added durability. And then, the decoration. This is where fans became art. The leaf would be painted, and we're not talking about simple designs. We're talking about miniature paintings by artists who had trained for years. Some fans featured copies of famous paintings, some showed mythological scenes, Venus and Adonis, Apollo and Daphne, stories that educated people would recognize. Some showed biblical scenes, appropriate for more religious households. Some showed contemporary events. There are fans commemorating battles, royal weddings, even the first hot air balloon flights in the 1780s. These were not just pretty pictures, they were talking pieces, conversation starters, ways to show that you were educated and aware of current events. The painting on a fan might include gold leaf, actual thin sheets of gold applied to add sparkle and richness. It might include sequins or tiny bits of mica to catch the light. Some fans had cutouts, portions of the leaf carefully cut away to create patterns, sometimes backed with different coloured silk to create a layered effect. The level of craftsmanship was astonishing. Now, imagine commissioning a fan. You are a wealthy lady in London, 1815. You've been invited to a particularly important ball, perhaps at Carlton House, the Prince Regent's residence. You want a fan that will reflect your taste, your status, your sophistication. So you visit a fan maker's shop. Maybe you go to Duvel-Leroy, a famous Parisian fan maker who opened a shop in London on New Bond Street. Or maybe you visit an English maker, someone with a royal warrant. You enter the shop and you are surrounded by fans. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, displayed in cases, hanging on walls, laid out on tables. Each one is unique. Each one is beckoning you to choose it. But you're not here to buy off the shelf. You want something custom. You want a bespoke fan. You sit down with the fan maker or his assistant. You discuss what you want. Perhaps you want a scene from your favourite opera painted on the leaf. Perhaps you want your family crest incorporated into the design. Perhaps you want sticks carved with a particular flower that has meaning to you. The fan maker takes notes. He shows you samples of ivory, mother of pearl, different silks. He discusses with you the artist who will paint the leaf, perhaps shows you examples of his work. This is a collaboration. This is art patronage on a small scale. And then he tells you the price. For a truly exceptional fan, you might pay anywhere from 5 to 20 guineas. A guinea was £1 and 1 shilling, a unit of currency used for luxury goods. 20 guineas was a substantial sum, remember. That is more than many working people earned in half a year. But for you, if you are wealthy enough, it is worth it. Because this fan will announce your taste to everyone who sees it. You place your order, and then you wait. Weeks, perhaps months. The artist needs time to paint. The carver needs time to perfect the sticks. When the fan is finally ready, you return to the shop. It is brought out, probably in a special box. You open the fan for the first time. You hear that satisfying snap as the sticks lock into their open position. You see the painting, the colours vivid and perfect. You feel the weight of it, substantial enough to feel valuable but light enough to use comfortably. This is yours. This is unique. No one else in London has this exact fan. Let me tell you about a specific fan, a real one that still exists. It is in a museum now, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This fan was made in France around 1770. But fans from that era were still being used and treasured in the Regency period. The sticks are mother of pearl, carved with incredible delicacy. The leaf is painted with a scene called the embarkation, showing elegantly dressed people boarding a boat, possibly for a romantic excursion. The colours have faded now after more than 250 years, but you can still see the skill of the artist. The faces are expressive. The fabrics of the clothing have texture. This tiny painting, no bigger than your hand when the fan is fully open, contains more artistry than many full-size paintings. This fan was estimated by the museum to be worth £2,000 to £3,000 in today's money when it was made. And it is just one example among thousands. Some fans were even more elaborate, even more expensive. But who owned these fans? Who carried them? Obviously wealthy women, but not just any wealthy women. Fans had to match your station. A young debutante would carry a relatively simple fan, elegant but not ostentatious. White or pale colours, modest decoration. She was advertising her innocence, her purity, her suitability as a bride. An older married woman could carry something more elaborate, more colourful, more daring in its subject matter. A widow in mourning might carry a fan with black sticks and sombre decoration. A woman known for her fashion sense might deliberately choose something unusual, something that would make people look twice and whisper about her bold taste. Men also used fans, though less commonly in England than in Spain or France. In Spain, even in the 1800s, men carried small folding fans and used them quite naturally. Spanish flamenco dancers, both male and female, incorporated fans into their performances, developing an entire vocabulary of movements that were incredibly expressive. But in England, fans were almost exclusively for women by the Regency period. A man carrying a fan would have seemed odd, possibly effeminate by the standards of the time. But here is something delightful. Fans were not just for looking at. They were functional. You actually used them to create a breeze. And in a world before air conditioning, before electric fans, before any kind of mechanical cooling, this mattered. Ballrooms were hot. Imagine hundreds of people in a room lit by countless candles. All those bodies, all that candlelight generating heat, women in multiple layers of clothing, men in tight-fitting coats and cravats. The air would become stifling. A fan was not just decorative, it was survival. You would snap it open and wave it in front of your face, creating blessed cool air. You would feel the breeze on your overheated skin. You would use the fan to shield your face from the direct heat of nearby candles. You would cool yourself enough to keep dancing, keep smiling, keep participating in the social ritual that mattered so much. And there was technique to fanning yourself. You did not wave it frantically like you were trying to put out a fire. That would look panicked, lower class, undignified. No, you fanned yourself with grace, slow, controlled movements. The fan opening and closing with a pleasant snap. The painted leaf creating moving pictures as it waved back and forth. Some women could fan themselves while doing other things, while talking, while walking, while holding a glass of punch in the other hand. It became automatic, an unconscious, graceful movement. But fans were also shields. Remember, Regency society valued modesty, restraint. A woman was not supposed to display too much emotion. If something shocked you, if something made you blush, if something made you laugh too loudly, you could quickly raise your fan to cover the lower half of your face. This served multiple purposes. It hid your expression. It gave you a moment to compose yourself, and it signalled to everyone watching that you were aware of your breach of decorum and were correcting it. Some women became very skilled at using their fans this way. They could hide behind their fans while still making eye contact. They could lower the fan slowly, revealing their face bit by bit, creating a kind of unveiling that was quite captivating. They could peek over the top of the fan with just their eyes showing. There is a reason fans appear in so many paintings of beautiful women from this era. Artists understood that a fan added mystery, added allure. Let me share something from literature. There is a quote from a 19th century New York Times article from 1854, written by someone using the pen name Minnie Myrtle. She wrote about fans, into what a consternation ladies would be thrown if suddenly deprived of this relief in all embarrassments. It is a curious fact that in all heathen as well as all Christian nations, it is a favourite shield of the gentle sex. In all histories of queens and courts and festivals, the fan is conspicuous. The true reason is that it is so graceful an appendage, and so kind a helpmeet in a moment of timidity or an hour of idleness. A helpmeet in a moment of timidity. That is lovely, is it not? The fan was a friend. It was something to do with your hands when you felt awkward. It was a way to occupy yourself when conversation lagged. It was an outlet for nervous energy. Have you ever been in a social situation where you wished you had something to hold, something to give your hands purpose? Regency women always had their fans. They never had to worry about what to do with their hands. There is also an element of theatre to fans. When a woman snapped open her fan, everyone nearby heard it. That sharp click of the sticks locking into place. It was an announcement. It said, "I am here. Pay attention." I'm about to cool myself, or hide my face, or possibly make a point without saying a word. Some women became famous for how they handled their fans. It became part of their personal style, part of how people recognized and remembered them. And fans were collectible. Wealthy women did not own one fan. They owned many. Dozens. Some women had collections of hundreds of fans, stored in special cabinets, organized by occasion, by season, by color. A fan collection was like a jewelry collection. It represented wealth, taste, and social participation. When a woman died, her fans might be passed down to daughters or granddaughters. They might be listed in wills. Particularly special fans with important provenance or exceptional artistry, became family treasures. Let me tell you about Princess Augusta, an aunt of Queen Victoria. Around 1790, Princess Augusta painted a fan herself. She was a talented amateur artist, and she created a fan with painted medallions showing various scenes. This fan still exists. It is part of the royal collection, owned by the current queen. That fan is over 230 years old, and it is still intact, still beautiful. It has survived because it was valued, because it was cared for, because it meant something beyond its practical use. Now, think about what this means in terms of material culture. We're talking about objects that were designed to be used, to be handled, to be waved around in hot ballrooms. They were not meant to be museum pieces. They were everyday items for the women who owned them. And yet, so many have survived. Why? Because people treasured them. Because a beautiful fan was worth preserving. Because even in an era before photographs, before easy ways to capture memories, a fan could carry associations. This was the fan I carried the night I met him. This was the fan my mother gave me for my 18th birthday. This was the fan I used at my first ball. Objects hold memories, and fans, intimate objects held close to the face, carried close to the heart, were particularly good at holding memories. Every time a woman opened a particular fan, she might remember where she had carried it before, who had admired it, what had happened while she held it. The fan became a diary of sorts, silent but evocative. So before we even get to the question of whether fans were used as a secret language, which is where everyone wants to rush, we need to understand what fans were. They were art, they were craftsmanship, they were status symbols and practical tools and memory keepers and fashion statements all at once. They were valuable enough to commission specially, common enough that no fashionable woman would be without one, and varied enough that they could express endless subtle distinctions of taste and occasion. But now that you understand the object itself, now that you can picture the ivory and silk and painted scenes, now that you can imagine the weight of it in your hand and the snap of it opening, we need to address the elephant in the room, or perhaps I should say, the fan in the ballroom. Because you have probably heard that fans were used to send secret messages. You have probably heard about the elaborate language of fans, and that story, that myth, that fascinating tangle of truth and marketing genius is where we are headed next. Because the language of the fan is real, but it is not quite what you think it is. Every love story needs a villain, and in our story, the villain is not a person, it is a myth. A beautiful, romantic, persistent myth that has captured imaginations for nearly 200 years. The myth of the secret language of fans. You know the one. Drawing your fan across your cheek means, I love you. Twirling it in your left hand means we are being watched. Dropping it means we can only be friends. This idea that Regency and Victorian women had an entire coded vocabulary using their fans, allowing them to have secret conversations right under the noses of their chaperones. It is incredibly romantic. It appears in countless historical novels, movies, documentaries, and it is mostly, though not entirely, fiction. I know, I am sorry. I hate being the one to break this to you. But stick with me, because the true story of how this myth was created is actually more interesting than the myth itself, and there is some truth buried in the legend, which makes it even more fascinating. We're about to dive into one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history, centuries before modern advertising even existed. We're going to meet a French businessman who understood human nature so well that he created a myth that outlived him by 200 years. Let us start in Paris, 1827. Napoleon has been defeated. The French Revolution and its aftermath have completely transformed French society. The elaborate court culture of the old aristocracy is gone, at least officially. And luxury goods makers are struggling. Why? Because fans, those beautiful accessories that has been essential for fashionable women for 2 centuries, are falling out of style. The French Revolution associated fans with the decadent aristocracy. Carrying an expensive fan was seen as old-fashioned, possibly even politically suspect. So fan makers are watching their business collapse. Enter Jean-Pierre du Villeroy. He is not the first fan maker in Paris. The du Villeroy company was actually founded by his father in 1827, though some sources say slightly earlier. But Jean-Pierre is the genius who saves the business. How? By inventing a need. By creating a reason for every fashionable woman to own multiple fans and to want to learn how to use them properly. He publishes a leaflet, a small pamphlet, explaining the language of fans. This pamphlet lists various gestures and what they supposedly mean. Carrying the fan in your right hand means this. Carrying it in your left hand means that. Drawing it across your forehead means something else entirely. Now here is the crucial question. Did de Villeroy invent this language completely, or was he documenting something that already existed? The answer is complicated. There were some fan gestures that were genuinely understood in society. Rapidly fanning yourself indicated you were very hot, obviously, but it also could indicate you were flustered or excited. Hiding your face behind your fan indicated modesty or embarrassment. Using your fan to point at someone, which was considered quite rude, indicated you were talking about them. These were common sense interpretations that anyone could understand, but the elaborate system that Duvilleroy described, the 20 or 30 specific gestures, each with a precise meaning, that was his invention, or at least his formalization of things that may have been done occasionally, but were certainly not a widespread understood code. And here is the brilliant part. The pamphlet was not just information, it was marketing. It was saying, look at this sophisticated thing that fashionable people know how to do. Do you want to be sophisticated and fashionable? Then you need to learn this. And to learn it, you need to practice. And to practice, you need to buy our fans. It worked. It worked spectacularly. Women read the pamphlet and thought, oh, I need to know this. Men read it and thought, I need to understand what women are telling me. The pamphlet was shared, copied, republished. Duvilleroy's business exploded. He opened a shop in London on New Bond Street. He became a supplier to Queen Victoria herself. The British royal family bought fans from him. He went from a struggling craftsman to one of the most successful luxury goods makers in Europe, all because he created a myth and sold it as truth, and people wanted to believe it. This is important. The myth of the fan language succeeded because it gave people something they desperately wanted. In an era of strict social codes and limited freedom of expression, especially for women, the idea that there was a secret language, a way to communicate forbidden things right in front of authority figures, was incredibly appealing. It was subversive in a safe way. It was rebellion that could be denied. If someone accused you of saying something inappropriate with your fan, you could just say, oh, I was simply cooling myself. I have no idea what you're talking about. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Some historians have tried to verify whether this fan language was actually used. They have gone through letters, diaries, novels from the period, and what they have found is almost nothing. Jane Austen, who wrote extensively about social interactions and included fans in multiple scenes in her novels, never once mentioned the language of fans. Not once. If this was a real, widespread practice, surely Jane Austen would have used it. She used everything else. There are no letters from Regency women saying things like, I signalled to Mr. So-and-so with my fan that I wanted to speak with him privately. There are no diary entries describing fan conversations. There are no etiquette books from the Regency period that teach the language of fans. The first real mentions of it appear after Duvilleroy's pamphlet. It is a Victorian invention, marketed as a Georgian or Regency tradition, but actually created in the 1820s and 1830s and becoming popular in the mid to late 1800s. Now, does this mean women never used fans to communicate? No. Of course they used fans to communicate, but they communicated the way we all communicate with body language and objects. General meanings, context-dependent meanings, not a formal code. If a woman was angry and snapped her fan shut sharply, everyone understood she was angry. The snap was emphatic, sharp, indicating her emotional state. If a woman slowly, languidly waved her fan while looking at a particular gentleman, people might interpret that as interest or flirtation. But these were not secret messages. They were obvious displays using an object to emphasize what was already clear. Let me tell you about Spanish flamenco, because this is where some real fan language did exist. Spanish dancers, particularly in Andalusia, developed a set of highly stylized movements with fans as part of their dance vocabulary. An open fan over the chest showing the painted design meant yes or assent. Showing the back of the fan meant no. An open fan covering one cheek meant I like you. Waving the fan very quickly intensified the meaning to I really like you, or even I desire you. A closed fan positioned by the heart meant I love you. An invitation to kiss was shown by placing an open fan over the lips. But notice something. These were part of a performance. These were theatrical gestures done by professional dancers who had trained in this vocabulary. They were not subtle. They were not secret. They were meant to be read by an entire audience. And even in Spain, there is debate about how much of this was genuine tradition and how much was formalized later for tourism and performance. So when English and French people heard about the Spanish fan traditions, they romanticized them. They imported the idea but made it more mysterious, more secretive. They turned performance art into espionage, and that is what de Villeroy was selling. The idea that you could be like those exotic Spanish dancers, but subtly, secretly in an English drawing room. But wait, you might be thinking, surely some people learned the code and used it, even if it was invented by a marketer. And yes, that is true. Some people did learn de Villeroy's system and tried to use it. But here is the problem. For a secret code to work, both people need to know it. Both people need to be using the same version of it. And there were multiple versions. Different fan makers published different pamphlets with different meanings for the same gestures. One pamphlet might say that holding your fan in your right hand meant follow me, while another said it meant you are too willing. How is anyone supposed to have a coherent conversation when the dictionaries disagree? Imagine trying to text someone but you are using autocorrect in English and they are using autocorrect in French. The messages would be nonsense. And even if two people had read the same pamphlet, they had to remember the codes. 20 or 30 different gestures. That is a lot to memorize. And you had to do these gestures while also managing all your other social obligations, while having actual verbal conversations, while dancing, while eating, while being watched by your mother or your chaperone. The cognitive load was absurd. One writer, looking back on this era, said it best. She noted that the language of fans relied upon the undivided attention of both parties, needed a clear understanding of the intricacies of the system they were using, and were far from private, open to interception by eyes that were not intended to see. In other words, it was time-consuming, confusing, and not actually secret. It was the worst possible system for secret communication. Compare this to the language of flowers, which was genuinely used in the Victorian era. Flowers had meanings, and people really did send bouquets with intended messages. A red rose meant passionate love. Yellow roses meant friendship. White lilies meant purity. This system worked because the meanings were relatively simple, widely known, and the message was delivered privately. You sent someone a bouquet, they received it at home. They looked up the meanings in one of the many published guides to florography, all of which mostly agreed on the basic meanings. There was time to interpret. There was privacy to respond. But fans, you were supposed to be having real-time conversations across a crowded room using a system that required perfect memory, perfect execution, and perfect interpretation. It was never going to work, and the evidence suggests it mostly did not work. So what was real? What did Regency women actually do with fans? They used them as I described earlier, for cooling, for hiding expressions, for emphasizing points, for indicating general mood and intention through obvious body language. A woman who was interested in a gentleman might fan herself while making eye contact with him, not because fanning herself meant I am interested in some secret code, but because it drew attention to herself, gave her something to do with her hands, and the eye contact made her interest obvious. A woman who was bored might fan herself lazily, the slow movement indicating her lack of engagement. A woman who was scandalized by something she heard might snap her fan shut, the sharp sound punctuating her disapproval. These were not codes. These were just people using props to emphasize what they were already communicating through their faces, their posture, Their words. And you know what? That is still meaningful. That is still interesting. The fact that the elaborate code was mostly fiction does not diminish the reality that fans were important social tools. They just were not secret message machines. Now let me tell you about something that really did exist, and it is delightful. It was called phanology, but it was not a secret language, it was a party game. In the late 1700s, a man named Charles Francis Bedini created something called phanology, or ladies' conversation fan. This was published in 1797. It was a fan, an actual physical fan, that had questions printed on one side and answers printed on the other. It also had instructions for using hand positions to spell out letters. Here is how it worked. At a party, guests would use these special fans to play a game. Someone would point to a question on the fan like, "Do you love music?" The other person would then indicate the number of a response by holding the fan in a particular position. The positions corresponded to numbers, and each number corresponded to a printed answer. So position 1 might mean yes, very much. Position 2 might mean only sometimes, and so on. This was entertainment. This was like a parlor game or charades. Everyone knew they were playing. It was not secret. It was social fun, a way to facilitate conversation at parties, particularly for shy people who might not know what to talk about. Some versions of these fans had the alphabet divided into groups, and you could use hand positions to spell out words letter by letter. But again, this was a game everyone was playing together, not a covert communication system. These phanology fans were popular for a while. They were novelty items, but they required you to have the special fan with the questions and answers printed on it. You could not do this with a regular fan, and even then it was cumbersome and limited. Most people played it once or twice, found it charming but difficult, and moved on. So when you hear about the language of fans in historical sources, you need to ask which era they're talking about. If they're talking about the Regency period, 1811 to 1820, the answer is that there was no widespread formal fan language. If they are talking about the Victorian era, the 1840s through the early 1900s, then yes, there were published guides and some people did try to use them, though how successfully is debatable. But even in the Victorian era, it was more aspiration than reality. The myth persists because we want it to be true. We want to believe that oppressed people, particularly women, found clever ways to subvert the rules. And they did find ways to subvert rules. But those ways were usually more direct than we imagine. A woman who wanted to communicate with a man she was not supposed to speak to might arrange to accidentally be in the same place at the same time. She might enlist a friend to carry messages. She might write a letter and have a trusted servant deliver it. These were risky, but they were effective. They were not dependent on whether the man remembered what position 3 in the fan alphabet meant. And honestly, if you wanted to send a secret message, why would you use something as public as fan gestures? Everyone at the ball could see you. Your chaperone could see you. If the message was truly secret, you would not be broadcasting it with large arm movements in a crowded room. Let me share one more thing. The writer Oscar Wilde wrote a play in 1892 called Lady Windermere's Fan. In this play, a fan appears at key moments and has significant symbolic meaning. The fan represents reputation, femininity, the social role of women. It is a powerful image, but nowhere in the play does anyone use the fan to send coded messages. Wilde knew about the supposed fan language. Everyone in the 1890s knew about it, but he used the fan symbolically, not as a communication device. Even in fiction, the fan language was more myth than practice. So what do we take away from all this? First, that marketing has been manipulating us for far longer than we think. de Villeroy created a need where none existed and sold a solution to that imaginary need. Modern advertising has nothing on him. Second, that myths persist because they fulfill emotional needs. We want secret rebellions. We want to believe that constrained people found clever ways to express themselves. And they did, just not in the specific way we've been told. Third, that the absence of the elaborate fan code does not make Regency fan use any less interesting. Real human behavior is always more complex and more interesting than any formal system could be. Fans were tools of emphasis, beauty, status, and general communication. They were works of art that also had practical purposes. They were expensive luxuries that signified taste and wealth. They were props that helped women navigate social situations with grace. All of that is true and fascinating. The fact that they were not encryption devices does not diminish their importance. But now we've taken apart the myth, we've looked at the reality, and we understand what fans actually were and how they were actually used. Which brings us to the third element of our trilogy. We've explored gloves, we've examined fans, and now we must turn to something even more intimate, even more personal, even more laden with meaning. We need to talk about scent, about perfume, about how smell, that most primitive of senses, the one most directly connected to memory and emotion, became a language all its own. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you could smell the past. Not the sanitized museum version of history, but the real thing. What would 18th century London actually smell like? I will tell you, and it is not pretty. Unwashed bodies, because bathing was rare and considered dangerous to health. Streets running with sewage and animal waste. Rotting garbage. Smoke from countless coal fires, the stench of tanneries and slaughterhouses. Thousands of people living in close quarters with no running water, no deodorant, no understanding of bacteria or hygiene as we know it. It was, to put it mildly, absolutely disgusting. And into this olfactory nightmare walked the aristocracy, drenched in heavy perfumes, trying desperately to mask the reality of human existence. Now, jump forward just 50 years to the Regency period. Something has changed. Something fundamental has shifted in how people think about smell, about cleanliness, about perfume itself. The heavy, musky, suffocating perfumes of the previous century are suddenly out of fashion. They're considered old-fashioned, even vulgar. Instead, people want light, fresh, clean scents, lavender, citrus, rosewater, delicate jasmine. The change is so dramatic, so complete, that it represents one of the most significant shifts in the history of perfume. And understanding why this happened tells us everything about how the Regency era saw itself, what it valued, what it was trying to become. So what changed? Two things, really. First, attitudes about bathing, and second, one man who became the most powerful person in Europe and happened to be obsessed with cologne. Let us start with the bathing, because it is genuinely shocking how recently humans discovered that washing yourself regularly was a good idea. For most of human history, at least in Europe, bathing was rare. The ancient Romans had bath culture, yes, but that knowledge was largely lost in medieval Europe. By the 1700s, most people believed that bathing was actually dangerous. They thought that water could seep into your pores and make you sick. They thought that the layer of dirt on your skin was protective. They thought that washing too frequently would weaken your constitution. Even wealthy aristocrats rarely bathed. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, legendary for his extravagance and luxury, reportedly took only 3 baths in his entire life. 3 in 77 years. So how did people manage? They changed their linen. The idea of cleanliness was not about water and soap. It was about fresh fabric next to your skin. A wealthy person would wear linen undergarments and change them daily, or even multiple times per day. The linen was supposed to absorb the dirt and sweat from your body. Once it was dirty, you replaced it with clean linen. Your outer clothes, your gowns and coats and breeches, those were rarely washed. But your undergarments, those were washed constantly. If you were wealthy enough to own multiple sets of linen and to employ people to do laundry, you could maintain some level of cleanliness. If you were not wealthy, well, you just smelled bad. But by the late 1700s, medical understanding was beginning to change. Doctors started suggesting that perhaps bathing was not dangerous after all. Perhaps they cautiously proposed washing your body with water might actually be beneficial. This was revolutionary thinking, and it started catching on among the educated classes, the people who read the latest medical texts and wanted to be modern and enlightened. Enter the metal bathtub. This British invention, the portable metal tub that could be brought into your bedroom and filled with heated water, made bathing practical for wealthy people. You no longer needed to go to public baths or natural hot springs. You could bathe in the privacy of your own home. Servants would heat water, pour it into the tub, and you could immerse yourself. It was luxurious, it was decadent, and increasingly it was fashionable. By the Regency period, the daily bath was becoming standard among the upper classes. Not everyone did it yet. Many older people still clung to the old ways, but young, fashionable people bathed regularly. And this changed everything about perfume. Because if you were actually clean, you did not need perfume to mask horrible body odor. You could wear perfume for pleasure, for beauty, for the subtle enhancement of your natural scent. Perfume became something entirely different. But the other major influence on Regency perfume was, improbably, Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, that Napoleon. The Corsican general who crowned himself Emperor of France, who conquered most of Europe, who terrified Britain for decades. That Napoleon was absolutely obsessed with cologne, and his obsession influenced an entire generation. Napoleon reportedly used 60 bottles of cologne per month. 60 bottles in 1 month. How is that even possible? What was he doing with it? He was drenching himself. He poured cologne over his head. He doused his clothes. He added it to his bath water. He even apparently rubbed it into his skin until it was almost raw. He could not get enough of the fresh, citrusy, clean smell of cologne, and everyone knew about this habit. It was widely reported. It became part of his legend. Now, Napoleon was Britain's enemy. He was the Corsican ogre, the threat across the Channel, the man who wanted to invade and conquer. British people were supposed to hate him. But here is the fascinating thing about humans. We often admire our enemies, especially when they are successful and powerful, and Napoleon was undeniably both. So even while British newspapers were printing caricatures mocking him, British gentlemen were quietly adopting his grooming habits. They wanted that same fresh, cologne-drenched smell. They wanted to project that same modern, powerful image. But Napoleon's wife, Josephine, she might have influenced perfume culture even more than he did. Josephine Bonaparte, Empress of France, spent more money on perfume than any person in French history. More than Marie Antoinette, who had been famous for her perfume extravagance. More than King Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who'd practically bathed in perfume. Josephine outspent them all. She had favourite perfume houses including Hubigant, Lubin and Rancé, all of which still exist today. She commissioned custom scents created specially for her. She had perfumes for morning, for afternoon, for evening. She scented her clothes, her gloves, her fans, her rooms. After she died, People said you could still smell her perfume in rooms she had frequented years earlier. What did Josephine prefer? Exotic scents. She loved musk, which was having a revival after falling out of fashion. She adored vanilla, which was relatively new to European perfumery, imported from the Americas. She favoured warm, sensual scents like cinnamon and cloves. She made these exotic fragrances fashionable across Europe. Wealthy women wanted to smell like Josephine, and so perfume makers started creating scents inspired by her preferences. But let us talk about specific scents and what they meant, because this is where it gets really interesting. Different perfumes signal different things about you: your age, your status, your character, even your romantic availability. Let me walk you through the perfume vocabulary of the Regency era. Lavender was the scent of respectability. It was clean, fresh, unpretentious. Lavender water was used by everyone from duchesses to housemaids. It was considered wholesome, appropriate, safe. A young woman wearing lavender was signalling modesty and virtue. A gentleman wearing lavender was signalling cleanliness and good sense. Lavender was also practical because it had insect-repelling properties, so sachets of dried lavender were placed in drawers and wardrobes to protect clothing. The scent became associated with well-maintained households and careful domestic management. Rose was romantic and feminine. Rose water had been popular for centuries, and it remained so in the Regency era. But there were different kinds of rose scents. Light, fresh rose water suggested youth and innocence. Heavier rose perfumes, darker and more complex, suggested maturity and sensuality. A married woman might wear rose, but so might a young debutante. The intensity made all the difference. Violet was delicate and refined. It was considered an aristocratic scent, perhaps because violets were associated with spring and freshness and new beginnings. Marie Antoinette had loved violets, and even after her execution, the scent retained its associations with royalty and elegance. A woman wearing violet perfume was making a statement about her taste and her social position. Jasmine was more controversial. It was beautiful, intoxicating, but also intensely sweet and potentially overwhelming. Jasmine at night, particularly in warm climates, releases a stronger scent, almost narcotic in its power. A woman wearing jasmine was being bold. She was not afraid to be noticed. This was not a perfume for shy young girls making their social debut. This was for confident women who knew their own power. Citrus scents, particularly lemon and bergamot, were considered modern and masculine, though women could wear them too. These were the scents in cologne, the aromatic water that Napoleon loved. Citrus smelled fresh, clean, uncomplicated. It was the opposite of heavy musk and ambergris. It said, "I am modern. I embrace cleanliness. I am not stuck in the old ways." Men particularly adopted citrus scents during the Regency, moving away from the heavier perfumes their fathers had worn. Sandalwood was a gentleman's scent, warm, woody, exotic, without being overwhelming. It had been imported from India for centuries, but it became particularly popular in the late Georgian and Regency periods. A man wearing sandalwood was sophisticated, well-travelled, or at least wanted to project those qualities. It was expensive, which was part of the appeal. Not everyone could afford real sandalwood oil. And then there were the exotic imports that Josephine had made fashionable. Vanilla, which smelled sweet and warm and slightly edible. Cinnamon and cloves, which brought to mind spice markets and far-off lands. Musk, which was deeply animal and sensual, made from the glandular secretions of deer or civet cats. These scents were controversial because they were so obviously sensual. They were not innocent. They were grown-up perfumes for grown-up people. Can you see how this worked? You could tell a lot about someone from their perfume. A young woman in simple lavender water was presenting herself as modest and marriageable. An older woman in complex jasmine and musk was announcing her maturity and confidence. A gentleman in fresh citrus cologne was signalling his embrace of modern hygiene and fashion. A dandy in subtle sandalwood was displaying his wealth and sophistication. Perfume was a language, but not a secret one. It was obvious. It was deliberate. It was part of your public presentation. Now, where did people buy these perfumes? That depended on your wealth and your location. In London, the most famous perfumer was Floris. Juan Femenias Floris, a Spaniard from Minorca, had opened a barbershop in 1730 in St. James's, the fashionable quarter of London. He had started making perfumes inspired by the scents of his Mediterranean homeland. By the Regency period, Floris was legendary. The shop on Jermyn Street, which still exists in the same location today, was where fashionable people went to buy perfume. Floris sold toilet waters, which were light perfumes in an alcohol base, meant for refreshing yourself throughout the day. They sold scented soaps. They sold the raw ingredients for people who wanted to mix their own perfumes at home. And for the very wealthy, they offered something special. Bespoke perfumes. Custom scents created exclusively for one person. Imagine being wealthy enough to commission your own personal perfume. You would visit Floris, meet with their perfumers, and describe what you wanted. Perhaps you want something that reminds you of your childhood garden. Perhaps you want something that no one else in London will have. The perfumer would take notes, would show you samples of different ingredients, would let you smell various combinations. Then he would create your perfume, mix it in his laboratory, let it age properly, and present it to you in a beautiful bottle. The formula would be recorded in Floris's ledgers, kept secret, available only to you. Whenever you needed more, you could order it, and they would mix it fresh from your unique formula. This was the ultimate luxury. This was perfume as personal identity. And the wealthy took it very seriously. Some families had signature scents that were passed down through generations. The formula for great-grandmother's rose and violet perfume would be treasured, recorded, preserved. When her granddaughter came of age, she might be given her own supply of that same perfume, connecting her to her family history through scent. But not everyone could afford Floris. So what did other people do? They made their own perfumes at home. Almost every large household had a still room, a small room where preserves were made, herbs were dried, and perfumes were created. The lady of the house, or sometimes a particularly skilled housekeeper or maid, would know how to make basic toilet waters and scented oils. They would use whatever was available. If they had a garden with roses, they could make rose water by distilling rose petals. If they grew lavender, they could make lavender oil. If they had access to oranges or lemons, they could create simple citrus waters. These homemade perfumes were not as refined as what you could buy from a professional perfumer. They were cruder, simpler, more variable in quality, but they were affordable and personal. A woman might create a perfume using her grandmother's recipe. She might experiment, trying different combinations of herbs and flowers. This was not just domestic work. This was creativity. This was artistry on a small scale. And here is something lovely. Perfumes were gifts. If you visited someone's home, particularly in the country, your hostess might give you a small bottle of her homemade perfume as a parting gift. This was not because she thought you smelled bad. It was a token of affection, a memory of your visit. Every time you used that perfume, you would think of her home, of the time you spent together. Perfumer's memory, captured in a bottle. People also kept what were called perfume cellars. These were special boxes or cases, usually quite beautiful, that held small bottles of different perfume ingredients. essential oils, floral waters, spice tinctures. You would use these to mix your own perfumes fresh each day. Perhaps today you wanted something floral, so you would mix rose and violet. Tomorrow you might want something fresher, so you would blend lavender and citrus. Your perfume could change with your mood, with the weather, with the occasion. This was not laziness or indecision. This was understood as refined taste. The ability to create a perfect scent for each moment showed sophistication and knowledge. And the bottles themselves. Oh, the bottles were works of art. Perfume bottles in the Regency era were made of crystal, cut glass, porcelain, sometimes even gold or silver. They were designed to sit on dressing tables, to be seen and admired. Some were shaped like urns or columns, mimicking classical architecture. Some were delicate and feminine, painted with flowers. Some were boldly modern, using new techniques in glassmaking to create unusual colours or effects. Collecting perfume bottles was a hobby for some wealthy women. Even empty, the bottles were beautiful enough to display. But here is something that will surprise you. There were perfume rings, actual rings that you wore on your finger that contained tiny amounts of perfume. They were hollow inside with a small chamber that could be filled with perfume-soaked cotton or a tiny sponge. Some had hinged lids that you could open to refresh the scent. Others were designed so the perfume would slowly seep through tiny holes, releasing fragrance throughout the day. Why would you wear a perfume ring? Partly because it was convenient. You always had your favourite scent with you. But also because it was intimate. The perfume was close to your skin, warmed by your body heat, becoming more potent. And when you raised your hand, the scent would waft toward anyone nearby. It was subtle but deliberate. A gentleman might catch the scent of your perfume ring when you extended your hand for him to help you from a carriage. A friend might notice it when you gestured while speaking. It was perfume as presence, as aura. These perfume rings were not cheap novelties. They were real jewellery, often quite expensive, made by skilled goldsmiths and jewellers. Some were set with precious stones. Some had intricate engravings. They were status symbols as much as they were functional objects, and they represented something important about how the Regency era understood perfume. It was not just something you splashed on and forgot about. It was something you carried with you, something that became part of your identity, something that literally touched your skin and moved through the world with you. So perfume in the Regency era was not what it had been a generation earlier. It was no longer about hiding horrible smells. It was no longer about thick, suffocating clouds of musk and ambergris. It had become lighter, more personal, more expressive. It had become about clean, about fresh, about subtle enhancement rather than desperate masking. The revolution in perfume was really a revolution in self-perception. People were beginning to see themselves as naturally clean, naturally pleasant, worthy of enhancement rather than desperate for disguise. And that shift, that fundamental change in how humans thought about themselves and their bodies, that is what the perfume revolution was really about. But we've only scratched the surface of how people created and used these scents. Now we need to step into the still room itself to understand the actual process of making perfume, the ingredients available, and the surprising challenges of capturing scent in an era before modern chemistry. Step into a still room with me, not metaphorically. Actually imagine you are standing in this small, cool room tucked away in the back of a large country house. The year is 1813. Morning sunlight filters through a single window. The air smells incredible. A mixture of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, roses laid out on muslin cloths to dry, lavender bundled in baskets, and something cooking on a small brazier. A woman stands at a heavy wooden table, her sleeves rolled up, her hands stained with flower petals. She is making perfume. And what she's about to discover is that capturing the scent of a living flower is one of the most difficult things a human being can attempt to do. Here is the fundamental challenge of perfume making. Scent is volatile. It disappears. It evaporates. It changes when exposed to heat or light or air. A rose in your garden smells glorious, but the moment you pick it, the scent begins to fade. By the time you get it to your still room, it smells different than it did on the bush. And when you try to extract the essential oil, the heat of the process often destroys or alters the very molecules that created the scent you loved. Some flowers simply cannot be captured. Their scent is too delicate, too complex, too dependent on the living plant to survive extraction. Let me tell you about the flowers that defeated Regency perfume makers. Lily of the Valley, that delicate sweet scent that is one of the most beloved perfumes in the world. In the Regency era, they could not extract it. The extraction methods available, primarily distillation, destroyed the scent. Too much heat, and Lily of the Valley smells like cooked vegetables instead of delicate flowers. So what did perfumers do? They created blends of other scents that approximated Lily of the Valley. Floris, that famous London perfumer we talked about, had been selling a Lily of the Valley perfume since 1765. But it was not actually Lily of the Valley. It was a carefully guarded blend of other flowers and oils that smelled similar. That formula was a trade secret, valuable because it solved an impossible problem. Other flowers that could not be captured: honeysuckle, lilac, sweet pea, regular lilies, magnolia, wallflowers, wood violets, gardenia, mignonette, which had the most incredible scent but absolutely refused to give it up to any extraction method. All of these flowers were loved, were grown in gardens specifically for their scent, but could not be turned into perfume. Not in the Regency era, not until modern chemistry developed synthetic versions decades later. So what could be extracted? What was our Regency lady in her still room actually working with? Roses, yes, but you needed an enormous quantity. To produce 1 ounce of pure rose essential oil required roughly 2,000 pounds of rose petals. 2,000 pounds. That is a ton. Literally. Can you imagine how many roses that is? How many rose bushes you would need? A single large English rose bush might produce a few hundred blooms in a season. You would need dozens of bushes, and you would need to pick the roses at exactly the right time, early morning after the dew has dried but before the sun has heated them and driven off the volatile oils. Lavender was easier. Lavender is hardy, prolific, and its essential oil is more stable. You could grow enough lavender in a good-sized herb garden to make useful quantities of lavender oil. This is why lavender water was so common. It was achievable for home production. The lady of a country house could reasonably expect to produce enough lavender water for her household's use without needing to buy it from professional perfumers. Herbs generally were easier to work with than flowers. Rosemary, thyme, mint, basil. They gave up their oils more readily, though the scents were not always suitable for perfume. They were more often used in cooking or in medicinal preparations. But rosemary water was sometimes used as a hair rinse, or mixed into other perfumes to add a fresh green note. Citrus was possible but required fruit, not just flowers. You would need oranges, lemons, bergamot. The oils came from the peel, not the juice. You would grate or press the peel, collecting the fragrant oil that came out. This was labour-intensive but effective. However, citrus fruits were expensive in England. Oranges and lemons were imported, often from Spain or Italy. Having enough to make perfume from them was a luxury. This is why professionally made colognes, which featured citrus prominently, were so expensive. Now let me walk you through the actual process of making a simple perfume at home. Our lady in the still room has decided to make rose water. She has collected rose petals, probably 30 or 40 large roses worth, picked early this morning. She inspects them carefully, removing any that are bruised or have insects on them. Only perfect petals for her perfume. She places the petals in a large copper still, adds water and begins to heat it gently over the brazier. This is distillation, the most common method of extracting scent in the Regency era. As the water heats, it creates steam. The steam passes through the rose petals, picking up the volatile oils. The steam then travels through a coiled tube that passes through cold water, which causes the steam to condense back into liquid. This liquid, which contains both water and rose oil, drips out into a collecting vessel. But here is the tricky part. She has to control the heat very carefully. Too hot, and she will cook the roses, destroying the delicate scent. Too cool, and the steam will not form properly, will not carry enough of the essential oils. She has to watch it constantly, adjusting the fire, testing the temperature. This process can take hours. For a small batch of rose water, she might spend an entire morning tending the still. And what does she get for her effort? If she is lucky, if everything goes right, she might get a pint or two of rose water. Not pure rose essential oil that would require much more sophisticated equipment and far more petals. Just rose water, which is water infused with a small amount of rose oil. But even that is valuable. That rose water can be used as a light perfume, as a skin toner, as a hair rinse, added to bath water, used to scent linens. She has created something useful and beautiful from her garden. But there was another method, and it was even more time-consuming. Enfleurage. This French word describes a process where fat is used to absorb scent. You would take a wooden frame, spread it with purified animal fat, usually lard or tallow, and then press fresh flower petals into the fat. The fat would gradually absorb the scent from the flowers. After a day or two, you would remove the spent flowers and replace them with fresh ones. You would repeat this process dozens of times, constantly refreshing the flowers until the fat was saturated with their scent. Then you would dissolve the scented fat in alcohol, which would separate the fat from the perfume oils. You would be left with an alcohol-based perfume that captured the true scent of the flowers. This method worked for delicate flowers that could not withstand the heat of distillation, but it required enormous amounts of fresh flowers, constant attention, and weeks or even months of time. This was not something a lady would do in her home still room. This was professional perfumer territory. Here is what strikes me as I imagine our lady working in her still room. She's doing chemistry. She does not call it that. She has no formal scientific training, but she's working with volatile compounds, controlling temperature and pressure, separating mixtures through distillation. She's practicing a science that humans had been refining for thousands of years, passing knowledge down through generations, learning by doing. The women who ran still rooms were practical chemists, even if no one acknowledged them as such, and they were creative. Because here is what many perfume makers discovered. Single-note perfumes were boring. A perfume that smelled only of rose was pleasant but simple. The magic happened when you blended. Rose and violet together created something more interesting than either alone. Lavender and lemon together smelled fresh and clean. Jasmine and sandalwood together created depth, complexity, something that changed as you wore it, revealing different notes over time. Perfume makers started thinking about top notes, middle notes, and base notes, though they did not use those exact terms yet. They understood through experience that some scents hit you immediately and then fade quickly. Those were the light, volatile notes like citrus or fresh herbs. Other scents took time to develop, revealing themselves gradually. Those were the middle notes like roses and violets, and some scents lasted for hours, providing the foundation for everything else. Those were the base notes like musk, sandalwood, vanilla. A well-made perfume was like a piece of music. It had an opening, a melody, a sustained bass line. It unfolded over time. When you first applied it, you smelled the top notes. An hour later, those had faded, and you smelled the heart notes. Hours later, all that remained was the base, subtle and warm against your skin. Creating this kind of complexity required real artistry. It also required having access to many different ingredients, which was why bespoke perfumery was so expensive. The perfumer needed bottles and bottles of different essences to work with. But even home perfume makers could experiment with blending. Our lady in the still room might have rose water she made herself, lavender oil she distilled last summer, and perhaps some essential oils she purchased from an apothecary or perfumer, maybe orange flower water which was popular, maybe a tiny precious amount of jasmine absolute, incredibly expensive but needed only in drops. She could blend these together, testing different proportions, creating her own unique perfume. Some women became quite known for their skills at this. If you were invited to a country house and your hostess was famous for her perfume making, she might give you a small bottle of her latest creation. This was a special gift, something made by her own hands, not purchased. It showed care, creativity, personal attention. And because she had made it herself, you knew that no one else in London had exactly that perfume. It was unique. Now there were also ready-made recipes, books of household management, passed down through families or purchased, often included receipts, which is what they called recipes, for making various perfumes and scented waters. These recipes often had wonderful names: the Queen of Hungary's water, lavender water after the manner of the French, eau de Chypre, Carmelite water, sweet water for the hair. The instructions were sometimes vague by modern standards. Take a quantity of rose petals could mean anything. Add spirit of wine until the mixture is of the right consistency, assumed you knew what the right consistency was. Learning to make perfume was an oral tradition as much as a written one. A mother taught her daughter. A housekeeper taught a young maid who showed aptitude. You learned by watching, by smelling, by doing it over and over until you developed the intuition to know when something was right. This is how most women's knowledge was transmitted in the Regency era. Not through formal schooling, which most women did not have access to, but through practical apprenticeship in domestic skills. And making your own perfume was not just a hobby or a way to save money. It was also a necessary skill because commercial perfumes could be adulterated or of poor quality. If you bought perfume from an unscrupulous dealer, you might get something that smelled right at first, but then went rancid or changed color or irritated your skin. There were no safety regulations, no ingredient labels, no way to know what you were actually buying. Making your own meant you controlled the quality. You knew exactly what went into it. But there were also risks to homemade perfume. Essential oils are powerful. They can cause skin irritation, allergic reactions, even poisoning if used improperly. Women sometimes learned this the hard way. There are records of people having terrible reactions to homemade perfumes, rashes, and burns from oils that were too concentrated or from plants they were allergic to. Bergamot oil, for example, which smells lovely and was popular in colognes, can cause severe skin sensitivity to sunlight. If you wore bergamot perfume and then went out in the sun, you could develop painful burns and blisters. People discovered these things through trial and painful error, and some ingredients were genuinely dangerous. Lead was sometimes added to perfumes as a preservative or fixative. Mercury compounds were used in some recipes. These substances are toxic. Using them regularly could lead to serious health problems. Some of the beautiful, pale-skinned ladies of the Regency era were actually suffering from low-level lead or mercury poisoning from their cosmetics and perfumes. They did not know. The symptoms, paleness, fatigue, digestive issues, could be attributed to many things. The connection to their perfumes was not understood, but for the most part the perfumes women made at home were relatively safe. They stuck to known ingredients, plants that had been used for centuries, methods that were tried and true. The risks came from buying commercial preparations that might contain who knew what, or from trying to be adventurous with new exotic ingredients without understanding their properties. Let me tell you about one particular incident that was recorded in a letter from the era. A young woman, newly married, wanted to impress her mother-in-law with her domestic skills. She decided to make perfume, following a recipe she found in a book. The recipe called for a plant called pennyroyal, an herb in the mint family. What the young woman did not know was that pennyroyal oil is extremely potent and can cause serious problems if used in large quantities. She used far too much, not understanding how to properly dilute essential oils. When she wore her creation, she became dizzy and nauseous. She had essentially poisoned herself mildly with too much pennyroyal. The letter recounting this, written by a friend, was sympathetic but also gently mocking. The poor girl had been trying so hard to be accomplished and instead had made herself sick. This story reminds us that these skills, which we might think of as quaint or simple, actually required real knowledge and experience. You could not just read a recipe and perfectly execute it. You needed training, practice, an understanding of ingredients that came from years of experience. The women who were truly skilled at perfume making had invested substantial time and effort into learning their craft. And they were proud of that skill. A woman known for her perfume making had a valuable accomplishment. She was not just decorative, she was productive, creative, knowledgeable. In a world where women's skills were often undervalued or dismissed as merely domestic, perfume making was something that commanded respect. It required artistry and science, both. It produced something beautiful and useful. It could even generate income if a woman sold her perfumes or was paid to create custom scents for others. So when we think about Regency women making perfume, we should not picture it as a simple, quaint hobby. We should picture it as real work that required real skill and produced real value. The lady in her still room was not playing, she was creating, and the perfumes she made, whether for her own use or as gifts or even for sale, were testament to her knowledge, her patience, and her artistic sensibility. But we have been focused on the making. Now we need to think about the using. Because having a beautiful perfume was only the beginning. How you wore it, when you wore it, how much you wore, where you applied it. All of these things communicated messages. All of these things could be done right or wrong, and the social rules around perfume wearing were just as complex, just as fraught with potential embarrassment as the rules around gloves and fans. So now we turn to the delicate art of wearing perfume in Regency society, where too much was vulgar, too little was neglectful, and getting it just right required a sensitivity to social cues that modern people can barely imagine. There is a moment that happens at every modern perfume counter. You test a perfume on your wrist, smell it, maybe spray a bit in the air. If you like it, you buy it, go home and spray it directly on your skin, your neck, your wrists, maybe behind your ears. This is so normal, so automatic, that we never question it. But if you tried to do this in Regency England, people would be horrified. They would look at you like you were rubbing raw chemicals on your body, which, from their perspective, you were. Because in the Regency era, you never ever applied perfume directly to your skin. That was considered dangerous, unhealthy, possibly even fatal. Why? Because Regency medical theory believed that your skin was porous, vulnerable, easily penetrated by foreign substances. They thought that applying concentrated perfume directly to your skin could allow it to seep into your body, where it might interfere with your natural humours, your vital fluids, your delicate internal balance. This sounds absurd to us now, but remember, they did not understand how skin actually works. They did not know about absorption rates or chemical compounds. They were working with theories that dated back to ancient Greece, theories that were genuinely believed by educated people, including doctors. So how did you wear perfume if you could not put it on your skin? You scented everything around your skin. Your clothes, your gloves, your handkerchiefs, your hair. Though not directly, you would scent the powder or pomade you used in your hair. You would perfume the water you washed with. You would scent your undergarments, your stockings, your shawls. You created a cloud of scent that surrounded you but never quite touched your actual flesh. This had interesting consequences. For one thing, your perfume became entangled with your possessions. If someone picked up your glove, it smelled like you. If you left a room, your scent lingered on the chair where you sat, on the cushions you leaned against. Your handkerchief, which you might loan to a friend or even to a gentleman if he needed it, carried your personal scent signature. These were intimate objects made more intimate by bearing your perfume. Let me walk you through a lady's perfume ritual. She wakes in the morning. Her maid brings water for washing, and this water has been scented. Perhaps rose water, perhaps lavender water, something light and fresh for morning. She washes her face and hands in this scented water. Already, before she's even dressed, she smells of her chosen scent. Then she puts on her undergarments, her chemise and stockings, which have been stored in a drawer with sachets of dried lavender or rose petals. These undergarments have absorbed that scent over days and weeks. When she puts them on, that scent warms against her skin, though it is still separated from her skin by the fabric. Her maid dresses her hair. If she uses powder, which was less common in the Regency than in previous eras but still done by some, the powder has been scented. If she uses pomade or oils to control her hair, those have been scented. Her hair, when finished, smells of whatever she chose. Perhaps jasmine, perhaps violet, something complementary to her water scent but not identical. Layering different scents was considered sophisticated. It showed you understood how scents work together. Then she puts on her gown. This gown has been hanging in a wardrobe that contains, again, sachets of dried flowers or herbs. Or perhaps the wardrobe itself has been lined with scented paper. The dress has absorbed subtle scent. When she moves, when the fabric rustles and shifts, tiny amounts of that scent are released. She's building layers of fragrance, none of them overpowering, all of them together creating her olfactory presence. Next, her gloves. Remember those precious kid leather gloves we talked about so extensively? Those were stored in perfumed boxes. Queen Charlotte kept hers in a perfumed box specifically for this purpose. When you put on gloves that have been stored with perfume, every time you move your hands, every time you gesture, you release small amounts of scent. Your hands are constantly in motion. Gloves were one of the most effective ways to carry perfume with you. And finally, her handkerchief. This was perhaps the most important scent carrier of all. A handkerchief was used constantly, to dab at your brow if you were warm, to cover your nose if you encountered a bad smell, which in cities happened frequently, to wave goodbye, to offer to someone who needed one. Handkerchiefs were soaked in perfume. You would take a clean handkerchief, sprinkle it liberally with your chosen scent, let it dry slightly, and then carry it with you. Every time you used it, you smelled your perfume fresh and strong. So by the time a lady left her house, she was wearing perfume in 5 or 6 different ways, all indirect, all working together. And here is what is fascinating. Because the perfume was on fabric, not skin, it behaved differently. It did not warm and change the way modern perfume does on skin. It did not interact with body chemistry. It was more stable, more consistent, but it was also more diffuse. Instead of concentrated scent at pulse points, you had gentle scent everywhere. You created an atmosphere rather than a statement. Now, how much perfume was appropriate? This is where things got tricky. Too much perfume was one of the worst social sins you could commit in the Regency era. It was considered vulgar, lower class, trying too hard. Why? Because the old aristocracy, the previous generation, had worn heavy, suffocating perfumes. That was old-fashioned. That was associated with the corrupt, decadent, pre-revolutionary court culture. Modern, refined people wore perfume lightly, subtly. You should be able to smell it only if you were quite close to the person. There is a wonderful quote from the period, though I am paraphrasing slightly, that said using strong perfume was considered an affront to codes of politeness. Can you imagine? Using too much perfume was not just a fashion mistake, it was rude. It was suggesting that you thought other people should have to smell you whether they wanted to or not. It was imposing yourself on their sensory experience without permission. In a culture that valued restraint and consideration above almost everything else, strong perfume was aggressive, but too little perfume was also a problem. If you wore no perfume at all, it suggested you were either too poor to afford it, which was shameful if you were trying to present yourself as genteel, or that you did not care about your appearance, which suggested laziness or low breeding. Perfume was expected, but it should be just barely noticeable. It should make people think she smells lovely without being able to identify exactly what they were smelling or being overwhelmed by it. This is so different from modern perfume culture, where we often wear perfume to be noticed, to make a statement, to leave a strong impression. Regency perfume was about subtle enhancement. It was about creating an aura of pleasantness without dominating a room. And judging this correctly required a sensitivity to social cues that modern people rarely develop. Let me tell you about someone who got it catastrophically wrong. There was a woman, this is documented in letters from the period, though I will not name her because that seems unkind, who desperately wanted to be accepted in high society. She had money, probably new money from trade or industry, but she lacked the polish of the aristocracy. She thought that if she wore expensive perfume, lots of it, she would seem more refined. She drenched herself in musk and jasmine. When she entered a room, people could smell her before they could see her. They would literally turn their heads, following the scent, and then see her and understand. She thought she was making a grand impression. She thought people were noticing her because she smelled wealthy and sophisticated. In reality, people were noticing her because she smelled overwhelming. Behind her back, they mocked her. They called her unkind names. They said she smelled like a perfume shop had exploded. They said she was trying to hide something, suggesting that under all that perfume she must smell terrible. None of this was said to her face, of course. That would have violated etiquette. But the gossip circulated. Her reputation suffered, and ironically, all her expensive perfume worked against her instead of helping her. This is the cruelty of social codes. They are often not explained explicitly, You're supposed to just know. And if you do not know, if you get it wrong, people will judge you harshly but rarely tell you directly what you did wrong. You're supposed to figure it out from subtle cues, from being excluded, from whispers you're not quite supposed to hear. Men had their own perfume rules, and they were even more restrictive. Men could wear cologne, those fresh citrus-based scents we discussed. They could use scented soap and hair pomade. They could have their linen washed with scented water, but they should never smell overtly perfumed. That would suggest effeminacy, which was one of the worst accusations you could level at a Regency gentleman. A man should smell clean, fresh, perhaps faintly of lemon or lavender or bay rum. But you should not be able to smell him from across the room. Beau Brummel, that arbiter of fashion we keep mentioning, was famous for his grooming rituals. He supposedly spent hours bathing and dressing each morning, but the result was meant to look effortless. He smelled clean and pleasant, but not heavily perfumed. This was the ideal. This was what other men tried to copy. The appearance of not trying while actually trying very hard. There were exceptions, of course. Dandies, men who took fashion to extremes, sometimes wore heavier perfumes. They were making a deliberate statement, pushing boundaries, but they were also often mocked for it. They were seen as going too far, as being more French than English, as being possibly not quite respectable. The line between fashionable and ridiculous was thin, and perfume was one of the places where that line was most visible. Now let me tell you about something lovely: personal scent signatures. Some women developed signature perfumes that became so associated with them that people would smell that scent and immediately think of that person. Perhaps a particular blend of rose and violet that one lady always wore. Perhaps a unique jasmine perfume that another favoured. These signature scents became part of how people remembered you, part of your identity. And there was something romantic about this. If a gentleman was courting a lady, he would come to associate her scent with her presence. When he smelled that particular combination of perfume, it would remind him of her even if she was not there. This is the power of scent and memory. Of all our senses, smell is most directly connected to the emotional centers of the brain. A scent can trigger memories more powerfully than a sound or an image. The Regency period understood this intuitively, even if they did not have the neuroscience to explain it. There are stories, probably apocryphal but charming nonetheless, of gentlemen who would steal a lady's handkerchief specifically because it carried her scent. He would keep it, would occasionally hold it, and breathe in her perfume, remembering her. This was considered deeply romantic if he was her accepted suitor, and deeply inappropriate if he was not. But either way, it shows how much meaning was invested in personal scent. Women also gifted scented items. We mentioned this before, but let me elaborate. If you visited a friend in the country, she might give you a handkerchief she had scented herself, or a small sachet for your own drawer, or even a tiny bottle of perfume she had made. This gift was saying, "Remember me. Remember this visit. Remember the time we spent together." And because scent is so tied to memory, it worked. Years later, you might come across that sachet or the handkerchief, and the scent, even if faded, would bring back memories of that visit, that friend, that moment in time. But there were also perfume mistakes that were more subtle than wearing too much. Wearing the wrong perfume for the occasion, for instance. Heavy, sensual perfumes like jasmine or musk at a morning call. Inappropriate. Those were evening scents, night scents. In the morning, you wore light florals or citrus. In the evening, you could wear something richer, deeper. Wearing heavy scent during the day suggested you did not understand the rhythms of social life, or worse, that you were trying to be seductive at inappropriate times. Similarly, young unmarried women were expected to wear lighter, more innocent perfumes, lavender, rose, violet, simple florals. Older married women could wear more complex sensual scents, musk, jasmine, sandalwood, exotic spices. A young debutante wearing heavy jasmine and musk would raise eyebrows. What was she trying to signal? Was she trying to seem more experienced than she was? Was she trying to attract inappropriate attention? People would wonder and gossip, and seasonal scents mattered too. Heavy perfumes in summer were uncomfortable and overwhelming. Summer called for light, fresh scents, lavender, citrus, light rose. Winter allowed for richer, warmer perfumes, spices, woods, deeper florals. Wearing heavy musk in August marked you as someone who did not understand subtlety or appropriateness. There is one more aspect of perfume wearing that we need to discuss, and it is slightly gross but important. Perfume was still being used to some degree to mask less pleasant smells. Not body odour specifically, because as we discussed, the upper classes were bathing regularly by this point. But other smells. Menstruation, for instance, was not managed the way it is now. Women used cloth pads that were washed and reused, but they were not always perfectly effective. There might be odour. Heavier perfume during that time of the month was understood and accepted. No one talked about it explicitly, but women knew. Similarly, if you were ill, if you had digestive issues or any other bodily problem that might create odour, extra perfume was a way to manage it discreetly. This was compassionate in a way. It gave people a way to handle embarrassing situations without having to talk about them directly. The fiction was that you just really liked perfume. The reality might be that you needed it for reasons no one wanted to discuss. And homes were perfumed too. Rooms were scented with perfume cakes, blocks of scented material that were heated on coal burners to release fragrance. Floors were sometimes strewn with fresh herbs or flowers that released scent when walked on. This was partly aesthetic, partly practical. Homes were not sealed the way modern homes are. Cold air came in through gaps around windows. Damp came up from cellars. Various smells from kitchens and privies wafted through. Perfuming rooms helped make them more pleasant. But here is what I find most beautiful about Regency perfume culture. Despite all the rules, despite all the ways you could get it wrong, despite the judgment and the gossip, people still managed to create something meaningful with scent. They still managed to express themselves, to create beauty, to leave impressions that lasted. The woman who mixed her own perfect blend of rose and lavender. The gentleman whose clean citrus scent made people feel comfortable around him. The hostess whose home always smelled of herbs and flowers. These were real achievements, small but genuine. Perfume in the Regency era was not just about smelling good. It was about creating an atmosphere of pleasantness and refinement. It was about showing that you cared about details, about beauty, about the comfort of those around you. It was about mastery of subtle social skills. And yes, it was also about status and wealth and all the complicated hierarchies of the time. But at its best, it was about creating something lovely in a world that was often harsh and difficult. So now we understand gloves, we understand fans, we understand perfume, we understand them as individual accessories, each with their own rules and meanings and possibilities. But of course, in real life, they did not exist separately. They existed together, in combination, creating a complete picture of a person. And that brings us to perhaps the most interesting question of all. How did people read these signs together? How did you walk into a room and immediately assess someone based on their gloves, their fan, their scent? How did these three elements combine to tell a complete story about status, character, and intention? That synthesis, that complete picture, is what we need to explore next. Imagine you have developed a superpower, not flying or invisibility or super strength. something subtler but just as valuable in Regency England. You can walk into a room and within 30 seconds, without hearing anyone speak, you can tell who is wealthy and who is pretending, who was born into society and who bought their way in, who is confident and who is desperate, who is available and who is spoken for, who understands the rules and who is faking it. How? You read the accessories, you look at gloves, fans and perfume as a complete picture, as a sentence made of 3 words, and you understand what that sentence is saying. This was a real skill that Regency people developed. Not everyone was good at it, but those who were, they had a tremendous social advantage. They could navigate rooms full of strangers and immediately know who mattered, who to approach, who to avoid. They could spot social climbers, identify potential marriage prospects, recognize fellow members of their class, all from observation, from reading the signals that everyone was broadcasting through their accessories. Let me teach you how to do it. Let me show you what they saw. A woman enters a ballroom. You're standing near the entrance, casually observing new arrivals as everyone did. She's perhaps 25 years old, elegantly dressed. But before you even register her gown, you notice 3 things. Her gloves are pristine white kid leather, opera length, perfectly fitted, no visible buttons because they are fastened on the inner arm where they cannot be seen. This is expensive. This is proper. Her fan is painted silk with carved mother-of-pearl sticks, not enormous but substantial, carried closed in her left hand, and as she passes you catch her scent. Light, floral, layered. Rose with something underneath, maybe violet, maybe jasmine. Subtle enough that you only smelled it because she walked within 3 feet of you. What have you learned? She is wealthy. Those gloves alone probably cost more than a housemaid earns in 3 months. She is properly fashionable. The glove length and style are exactly right for a formal evening. She's confident enough to carry an expensive fan closed, not clutching it nervously or waving it for attention. And her perfume suggests refinement. She understands subtlety. She's not trying too hard. Conclusion? Old money, properly raised, comfortable in this environment. She belongs here. You can approach her without worrying that you're making a social mistake. Now, a second woman enters, also well-dressed, also around the same age. But watch carefully. Her gloves are white, yes, but they are slightly too loose. You can see wrinkles around the fingers. They might be borrowed, or she might have lost weight and not replaced them yet. Her fan is elaborate, expensive-looking, with painted scenes and gilt edges, and she's carrying it open, waving it actively even though the room is not particularly warm. And her perfume, you smell her from 10 feet away. Heavy jasmine, almost overwhelming, musk underneath. She smells expensive, but she smells loud. What does this tell you? She's trying hard, perhaps too hard. The loose gloves suggest either financial constraints or inattention to detail, neither of which are good signs in this context. The elaborate fan carried open and waving suggests she wants to be noticed, wants to display the expensive object. This is not the behavior of someone confident in her position. And the perfume, that heavy, obvious perfume, that is the real giveaway. Old money does not announce itself with loud perfume. Refined people wear perfume lightly. This woman is either new to society, or she's not quite as wealthy as she wants to appear, or both. You make a mental note. Approach with caution. She might be perfectly pleasant, but she is not quite in the inner circle. Now, a third woman. Older, perhaps 40. Her gloves are not white. They are elegant dove grey, kid leather, shorter than opera length, ending just past the wrist. Her fan is simple, almost plain. Ivory with minimal decoration, carried loosely in her right hand. Her perfume, you cannot smell it at all until she's very close, and then it is subtle lavender with something woodsy underneath. Sandalwood, perhaps. This woman is interesting. The grey gloves tell you she's beyond the age of needing to prove her purity through white kid leather. She's established, confident enough to choose colour. The simple fan suggests either that she is so secure in her position that she does not need to display wealth, or that she has restrained classical taste. And the subtle perfume confirms it. This is a woman who knows exactly where she stands. She's probably married, probably wealthy, and definitely not trying to impress anyone. She might be one of those formidable society matrons who everyone respects and slightly fears. You would need to be introduced by someone she respects before approaching her directly. Do you see how this works? Each element alone tells you something, but together they tell you a story. They create a complete picture. And Regency people were constantly reading these pictures, constantly assessing everyone around them, because social navigation depended on knowing who you were dealing with. But let me show you some combinations that sent very specific messages. A young woman, first season, at her debut ball. White gloves, pristine, opera length, perfectly fitted. A delicate fan, probably painted with pastoral scenes or flowers, carried almost nervously, opened and closed repeatedly. Light perfume, probably simple rose water or lavender, barely detectable. This combination screamed innocent debutante. It was saying, I am young, I am pure, I am inexperienced but properly raised. Please approach me gently because I am learning the rules. A wealthy widow, out of full mourning but still observing half mourning. Lavender or grey gloves, good quality but not ostentatious. A fan with darker colours, perhaps black sticks with painted scenes in muted tones. Perfume that was more complex, maybe rose with musk, something that suggested experience and maturity. This combination said, I have been married, I have lost my husband, I am grieving but re-entering society. I am no longer bound by the same rules as unmarried girls. Approach me with respect for my loss, but also recognize that I am an independent woman now. A married woman, happily so, secure in her position. Gloves in whatever length and colour suited her outfit, but always of good quality, always well maintained. A fan that reflected her personal taste, whether elaborate or simple, but always appropriate for the occasion. Perfume that was her signature, whatever she had chosen to define her scent identity. This combination said, I am established, I am content, I know who I am, and I have stopped trying to impress anyone except perhaps my husband. A social climber, desperately trying to appear wealthier than she was. Gloves that were expensive but slightly wrong. Maybe the colour was too fashionable, too trendy, suggesting she was following fashion magazines rather than setting trends. A fan that was overly elaborate, too expensive, calling too much attention to itself. Perfume that was too strong, too obviously costly. This combination sent mixed signals. Each element said expensive, but together they said trying too hard. And people noticed. They always noticed. Now men had their own versions of this. A wealthy gentleman at a formal dinner. Gloves of pale buff or white kid, perfectly fitted, removed as left with a servant in the entrance hall. No fan, obviously, but a walking stick, probably with a decorative handle, also left in the hall. Scent of fresh citrus cologne, very subtle, combined with the smell of clean linen and expensive soap. This said, I am a gentleman of means and taste. I understand propriety. I have a body servant who ensures my grooming is perfect. I take care with my appearance but do not obsess over it. a dandy pushing the boundaries of acceptable fashion. Gloves that were perhaps slightly too fashionable, maybe with unusual buttons or embroidery. A walking stick that was definitely too ornate, with a jewelled or overly decorated handle. Perfume that was a bit stronger than strictly proper, maybe sandalwood or even a hint of musk. This combination said, I am making a statement. I care deeply about fashion. I am willing to push boundaries. I am probably either independently wealthy or deeply in debt from maintaining this appearance. Approach me if you want entertainment and scandal. Avoid me if you want propriety. An older gentleman, established in society and business. Gloves that were functional and well made but not showy. A simple walking stick that was about support and style rather than display. The faintest scent of bay rum or lavender, so subtle you might not even consciously register it. This said, I have nothing to prove, I am secure in my position, I value substance over show, and I probably have money and influence but will not brag about it. But there were also combinations that sent warning signals, red flags that something was not quite right. Expensive gloves but a cheap fan. This suggested someone who had spent all their money on the most visible accessory and economized elsewhere. Experienced observers would notice. A heavily perfumed person whose gloves showed signs of wear or mending. This suggested someone trying to mask something, possibly poor hygiene, possibly the fact that they could not afford new gloves. Mismatched formality was another giveaway. Formal opera gloves but a casual day fan at an evening event. This showed lack of understanding of the rules. You were supposed to match formality across all elements. If your gloves were formal, your fan should be formal. Your perfume should be appropriate for evening. Everything should work together to create a coherent picture. When the elements did not match, it suggested either ignorance or poverty or both. And there were mistakes that were genuinely embarrassing. A woman once appeared at a ball, this is documented in a letter, wearing beautiful expensive gloves carrying an exquisite fan, but she had clearly over-applied her perfume. The letter writer described how the woman left a wake of scent behind her as she moved through the room, how people stepped back when she approached, how they made faces behind her back. Her expensive accessories actually worked against her, because the perfume mistake was so egregious that it overshadowed everything else. Another story tells of a young man newly arrived in London from the country, trying to make a good impression. He bought expensive gloves, commissioned an elaborate walking stick and doused himself in cologne. But he combined them all wrong. He wore formal evening gloves to a daytime visit. He carried his elaborate walking stick indoors instead of leaving it in the hall, and his cologne was so strong that his host dog started sneezing. Everything he did screamed, I do not understand the rules, and of course people talked about him. He became a cautionary tale. But there were also success stories. Women who managed their accessories so perfectly that they became famous for it. Men whose grooming was so impeccable that they set trends. These people understood that accessories were not just objects. They were a language, and speaking that language fluently gave you power. There is a description of one particular lady, I wish I could remember her name but it is lost to history, who was renowned for her perfect taste. The description says that she never wore anything that called attention to itself individually, but somehow, when you looked at her complete appearance, everything harmonized so perfectly that you could not look away. Her gloves, her fan, her perfume, her gown, her jewellery, her hair, everything worked together to create an impression of effortless elegance. People tried to copy her, but they could never quite get it right because they were copying individual elements instead of understanding the whole picture. This is the thing about really sophisticated style. You cannot fake it by buying expensive things. You have to understand proportion, harmony, appropriateness. You have to know when to be subtle and when to make a statement. You have to read the room and adjust. The same accessories that were perfect for an intimate dinner party would be wrong for a grand ball. The same perfume that worked in winter would be overwhelming in summer. Learning to read accessories, learning to use them correctly yourself, this was part of the education of every upper-class person. Mothers taught daughters, older sisters guided younger ones, gentlemen observed men they admired and copied their practices. It was an unwritten curriculum taught through example and correction, through subtle hints and mortifying mistakes, and the truly skilled could read not just current status but trajectory. They could identify a family on the rise, a fortune being made by watching how accessories improved over time. They could spot a family in decline by noticing when gloves started showing wear, when fans became simpler, when perfume became less distinctive. These were early warning signs of financial trouble, visible long before more obvious markers like selling property or reducing staff. Because here is the cruel truth. Maintaining the proper accessories was expensive, constantly buying new gloves as old ones wore out, commissioning or buying fans that reflected current taste, purchasing or making perfumes that were suitable for your position. This was a continuous financial drain. Only people with reliable income could keep it up. When the income faltered, the accessories were often the first place it showed. You might keep living in your big house, might keep wearing gowns you'd owned for years, but your gloves would start looking shabby. Your fan would become dated. Your perfume would become simpler or non-existent. So reading accessories was not just about assessing current status. It was about predicting future status. It was intelligence gathering. And in a world where marriages were business transactions, where social connections could make or break careers, where one bad association could ruin a reputation, having good intelligence mattered enormously. This might seem cold, calculating, mercenary, and it was all of those things. But it was also how the system worked. Nobody was born knowing these rules. Everyone had to learn them, and the people who learned them best had opportunities that others did not. They made better marriages. They formed more powerful friendships. They avoided social disasters. The language of accessories gave them a tool for navigating a complex, hierarchical, sometimes cruel world. But now we have to ask ourselves something. We've spent this entire journey looking at how this system worked, how people communicated through objects, how they navigated impossible social pressures. We've admired their creativity, their ingenuity, their ability to create meaning within constraint. But what does this all mean for us today? Why does any of this matter now, when we live in such a radically different world? What can we possibly learn from Regency gloves and fans and perfume that has any relevance to our modern lives? That is the question we need to explore as we bring this story to its close. What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, you're doing exactly what Regency women did with their gloves and fans? You're communicating without words. You're broadcasting information about yourself through objects and choices. You're reading signals from others, making judgments about who they are based on surface-level observations. You're navigating social hierarchies and unspoken rules. The medium has changed. The specific objects are different. But the fundamental human behaviors, those have not changed at all. And that realization, that recognition of ourselves in these people from 200 years ago, that is where this story becomes more than just history. That is where it becomes a mirror. Think about the last time you chose an outfit for an important event. Maybe a job interview, maybe a first date, maybe just drinks with friends you wanted to impress. You stood in front of your closet and you made choices, not random choices. strategic choices. This shirt says professional. That dress says confident. These shoes say I made an effort, but not too much effort. You are speaking a language, communicating through objects, just like a Regency lady choosing which gloves to wear. The vocabulary has changed. The grammar is different, but it is still a language. Or think about your phone, that rectangle of glass and metal that goes everywhere with you. What case do you have on it? Expensive designer? Practical and plain? Covered with stickers? That case is communicating something about you, whether you intended it to or not. It is your fan. It is an object that travels with you, that people see, that makes a statement. Some people have phone cases that cost more than other people's phones. Some people change cases frequently to match their mood or outfit. Some people keep the same scratched, battered case for years. Each choice tells a story. And perfume? We still wear it. We still use scent to create impressions. True, we apply it differently, directly to skin rather than to fabric. But the social calculations are remarkably similar. Is this perfume too strong for the office? Is this cologne appropriate for a funeral? Will this scent remind them of someone else? We're still using scent as communication, still worrying about the same basic questions of appropriateness and impression management that Regency people worried about. But here is where it gets really interesting. Our modern equivalent of the Regency accessory system is not just physical objects, it is digital. Think about your social media profiles, your carefully chosen profile picture, your bio that you've probably rewritten a dozen times, the photos you post and, more importantly, the photos you do not post, the accounts you follow, the content you share. You're creating a curated image of yourself, a presentation that communicates who you are, or at least who you want people to think you are. This is gloves and fans and perfume for the digital age, and people are reading those signals just like Regency people read accessories. They're looking at your Instagram and making judgments about your wealth, your taste, your values, your availability. They're checking your LinkedIn to assess your professional status. They're scrolling through your Twitter to determine if you are someone they want to engage with. We like to think we're beyond this kind of surface-level judgment. We like to believe we see deeper, that we value substance over presentation. But are we really that different from those Regency gossips assessing gloves in a ballroom? Here is what I find both comforting and unsettling. The constraints have changed, but humans keep creating new ones. Regency women could not speak freely, so they developed elaborate nonverbal codes. Modern people can speak freely, can publish their thoughts instantly to the world, but we've created new constraints. Cancel culture, employer monitoring of social media, the permanence of digital records. We have freedom of expression in theory, but many people self-censor constantly, carefully curating what they say online, aware that the wrong post could ruin a career or relationship. Is this really so different from a Regency woman carefully managing her reputation through her accessories? And constraints still breed creativity. TikTok dances, meme formats, emoji combinations that convey complex meanings. We have created new languages, new ways of communicating that work within the constraints of digital platforms. A string of emojis can convey emotional nuance that would take paragraphs to explain in words. A particular meme format can comment on social issues with humor and insight. We're still doing what humans have always done, finding ways to say things that cannot be said directly, finding ways to connect despite restrictions. But let me push on something uncomfortable. We have so much more freedom than Regency women did. We can vote, we can own property, we can choose our careers, our partners, our lives. We can speak openly about things they could never mention. And yet, are we happier? Are we more connected? Are our relationships deeper? I am not suggesting we should return to Regency constraints. That would be absurd and cruel. But I am suggesting that maybe we have lost something in gaining our freedom. Maybe there was value in the anticipation, the subtlety, the way small gestures carried enormous weight because they were so rare. Think about that moment we described, when a gentleman slowly removed a lady's glove and they both felt that electric connection. Compare that to modern dating, where you can see someone's entire life history before you even meet them, where physical intimacy often comes before emotional intimacy, where nothing is left to anticipation or imagination. Which approach leads to deeper connection? I genuinely do not know. But I think the question is worth asking. Or think about the art of letter writing, which was closely related to the world of Regency accessories. People wrote letters that took days or weeks to arrive. They crafted their words carefully, knowing they had one chance to make their meaning clear. They waited for responses with genuine suspense. Compare that to modern texting, where you can have an entire conversation in minutes, where you can see when someone has read your message, where the expectation is immediate response. We have gained speed and convenience, but have we lost depth? Have we lost the pleasure of anticipation? I am not romanticizing the past. Regency women who could not vote or own property would probably have gladly traded their elegant gloves for modern freedoms. The men who died from infected wounds because medicine did not understand germs would have been thrilled to have modern antibiotics. The children who worked in factories and mines would have loved modern child labour laws. The past was brutal in many ways, but it was also rich in some ways we have lost, and here is what I think is the core lesson. Constraint and creativity are linked. When you can do anything, when you can say anything, when you have infinite options, decision-making actually becomes harder, not easier. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice. Having too many options can lead to anxiety and dissatisfaction. But when you have constraints, when your options are limited, you become more creative within those limitations. You find meaning in small gestures. You appreciate subtle distinctions. Regency women turned gloves into poetry because they had to. They developed exquisite sensitivity to perfume because it was one of the few areas where they could express personal taste. They found ways to communicate romantic interest through tiny signals because overt expression was forbidden. The constraints were real and often oppressive, but they produced genuine artistry and ingenuity. What are our constraints? What are we being creative within? I think we are still constrained, just differently. We are constrained by time. Modern life is fast, demanding, exhausting. We're constrained by attention. We are bombarded with information, with content, with demands on our mental energy. We are constrained by expectations that we should be constantly productive, constantly connected, constantly improving ourselves, and within those constraints we are being creative. We are developing new ways to manage time and attention. We are creating new forms of art and expression. We are finding ways to be human in an increasingly digital world. But I worry that we are not being as intentional as the Regency people were. They knew they were playing a game. They understood the rules, even if they sometimes chafed against them. They were conscious of the messages they were sending with their choices. Are we? When you post on social media, are you consciously thinking about what you are communicating? Or are you just reacting, just sharing, just putting content out into the void without thinking about its impact or meaning? The Regency period teaches us that communication is always happening, whether we intend it or not. Your gloves communicated even if you did not think about them. Your scent communicated even if you did not choose it carefully. In the same way, your digital presence communicates even when you're not actively posting. Your absence communicates. Your silence communicates. Everything is a signal, whether you mean it to be or not. So maybe the lesson is to be more intentional, to think about what you are communicating with your clothes, with your possessions, with your digital presence, with your actual words and actions. Not to be fake or manipulative, but to be conscious, to recognize that you are always telling a story about yourself, and you might as well be the author of that story rather than letting it be written by accident. There is another lesson here about class and privilege that we cannot ignore. The Regency accessory system was fundamentally a class marker. It was designed to separate the wealthy from the poor, the refined from the vulgar. It was a barrier to social mobility, a way of keeping people in their assigned places. And our modern equivalents do the same thing. Designer clothes, expensive tech, the right brands, these are still class markers. We still judge people based on surface-level signals. We still create barriers to entry that have nothing to do with actual merit or character. But here is the difference. We at least acknowledge that this is wrong. We at least aspire to a world where people are judged on their abilities and character rather than their accessories. Regency people thought the class system was natural, proper, ordained by God. We know better. We know that accident of birth should not determine your opportunities. We still fail to live up to our ideals, but at least we have the ideals. That is progress, even if it is incomplete progress. And there is something beautiful about the Regency approach to accessories that we could benefit from reclaiming. The attention to detail, the appreciation for craftsmanship, the idea that objects can be meaningful, can be cherished, can be worth caring for. We live in a disposable culture. We buy cheap things that fall apart and throw them away, and buy more cheap things. What if we approached possessions the way Regency people approach their gloves? What if we bought fewer things but better things? What if we took care of them, repaired them, valued them? There is a sustainability argument here. The Regency model, where you owned a few good things and maintained them carefully, is actually more environmentally friendly than our modern model of constant consumption. Their gloves were expensive, but they lasted, were cleaned carefully, stored properly, treated as valuable. Our cheap gloves are worn once and discarded. Which model is actually better? But more than that, there is a quality of life argument. There is pleasure in having beautiful things that you use regularly. There is satisfaction in maintaining and caring for possessions. There is a kind of mindfulness in paying attention to small details. Regency people lived more slowly in some ways. They had time to appreciate the carved ivory on a fan. They had time to mix a perfect perfume. They had time to carefully pull on gloves and admire how they fit. We are always rushing, always multitasking, always on to the next thing. Maybe we are missing something. And finally, there is a lesson here about human connection. The Regency accessory system was ultimately about connecting with other people, about being understood, about finding ways to express yourself and read others despite all the barriers and rules and constraints. That need has not changed. We still want to be seen, really seen, by other people. We still want to find our tribe, our people who get us. We still want romance and friendship and belonging. The tools have changed, the platforms are different, but the needs are eternal. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something from people who took connection so seriously that they turned gloves into a language, fans into poetry, and perfume into memory. They worked so hard to bridge the distance between people. They invested so much care and attention into the art of being understood, Can we say the same? When was the last time you put that kind of thought and care into how you presented yourself to someone you wanted to connect with? I am not saying we should bring back the restrictions. I am not saying we should return to rigid social hierarchies and constrained gender roles. But I am saying that we should not dismiss everything about the past as simply backward or oppressive. There was sophistication there. There was artistry. There was a level of attention to human interaction that we might benefit from reclaiming, even as we keep our hard-won freedoms. So as we prepare to close this journey, as we get ready to leave the ballrooms and still rooms of Regency England and return to our modern world, I want you to take something with you. Take the idea that communication is an art that can be practiced intentionally. Take the idea that constraints can spark creativity if you work with them rather than just resenting them. Take the idea that small details matter, that the care you put into choosing how you present yourself is worthwhile. Take the idea that humans have been figuring out how to connect with each other for thousands of years, and we are still figuring it out, and that is okay. That is the human project. That is what we do. And maybe understanding how our ancestors did it can help us do it better. So let us bring all of this together now. Let us look at what this entire journey has taught us, and let us figure out what it means to carry these lessons forward into our complicated, beautiful, frustrating modern world. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from that first candlelit ballroom in 1815 to this moment right now, wherever you are, whenever you're listening to this. We have watched young women navigate impossible social pressures with nothing but kid leather and silk. We have learned that the myths we tell ourselves about the past are often more revealing than the facts. We have seen how humans, when constrained, become astonishingly creative. And we've discovered that we are not so different from those people 2 centuries ago, even though everything about our world has changed. But there is one more thing I want to share with you before we part. One more story that brings all of this together in a way that I think will stay with you. It is 1830. The Regency era is technically over. George the has died, and William the is now king. But society has not changed dramatically yet. The rules we have been discussing are still mostly in force. A woman, let us call her Catherine, though that is not her real name, is now elderly. She's perhaps 70 years old, which is quite old for this era. She's sitting in her drawing room, and her granddaughter, age 16, is visiting. The granddaughter is preparing for her first London season. She is nervous, excited, terrified. She knows that the next few months will determine much of her life, whom she will marry, what her social position will be, whether she will be considered a success or a failure. It is an enormous amount of pressure for a 16-year-old to bear, and she has come to her grandmother for advice. Catherine looks at this girl and she sees herself 60 years earlier. Same fears, same hopes, same sense that the world is watching and judging every move. And she tells her granddaughter something that was recorded decades later by that granddaughter in her own memoirs. Catherine says, and I am paraphrasing because the exact quote has been translated and retranslated over the years, "My dear, they will tell you that your gloves must be perfect, your fan must be fashionable, and your perfume must be subtle, and they are right. These things matter. But remember this, the gloves are just leather, the fan is just silk and ivory, the perfume is just flowers and water. What matters, what has always mattered, is the woman inside all of it. Make sure that woman is worth knowing." This advice was remarkable for its time. Most grandmothers were telling their granddaughters to focus on appearances, to follow the rules, to make themselves marriageable above all else. But Catherine was saying something different. Yes, play the game. Yes, follow the rules. But do not lose yourself in the process. Do not become just a collection of accessories. Be a person. Did the granddaughter follow this advice? According to her memoirs, she tried. She wore the right gloves and carried the right fan and used the right perfume, but she also educated herself. She read widely. She developed opinions. She chose her husband based on character rather than title, which scandalized some people but led to a genuinely happy marriage. And when she was old, she passed the same advice down to her own granddaughter. Be the person inside the accessories. Do not let the accessories be all you are. I love this story because it recognizes both realities. Yes, the system existed. Yes, the rules mattered. You could not just ignore them without consequences, but also you had agency. You had self. You could work within the system while retaining your humanity, your individuality, your actual personality. The women we have been talking about, they were not just fashion plates. They were not just beautiful objects following rules. They were complex human beings with thoughts and feelings and desires and frustrations and dreams. The accessories were just one part of their lives, one way they navigated their world. And I think that is the most important thing to take from this entire journey. When we look at history, especially at women's history, it is easy to see only the constraints, to see only what they could not do, could not say, could not be. And those constraints were real and often cruel. But if we see only the constraints, we miss the people. We miss their creativity, their resistance, their humanity. We miss the fact that they found ways to live full lives despite everything stacked against them. The gloves and fans and perfume were not just tools of oppression, though they were partly that. They were also tools of expression, ways of saying things that could not be said, ways of claiming small spaces of autonomy and beauty in a world that offered women very little of either. A woman who mixed her own perfect perfume was not just following rules. She was creating. She was experimenting. She was finding pleasure in chemistry and artistry. A woman who chose her gloves carefully was not just displaying wealth. She was exercising taste, making decisions about how she wanted to present herself. A woman who carried a beautiful fan was not just following fashion. She was appreciating art, surrounding herself with beauty. These were small freedoms, small pleasures, but they mattered. They made life bearable, even enjoyable sometimes. And that is true for us too. We all have constraints. We all have systems we must work within. We all have rules we cannot simply ignore without facing consequences. But within those constraints we have choices. Small ones maybe, but choices nonetheless. How we present ourselves, what we surround ourselves with, how we express our individuality. These things still matter. And here is something else that matters. Memory. The reason we know about Regency gloves and fans and perfume is because people cared enough to document them, to save them, to write about them. Someone kept those gloves in a museum. Someone preserved those fans. Someone recorded the perfume formulas. Someone wrote letters and diaries and memoirs describing daily life in detail. Because of them, we can connect with people who lived 200 years ago. We can understand something of how they thought, how they felt, how they lived. What are we documenting for people 200 years from now? What will they know about how we lived? Our digital records might be more extensive, but will they be as meaningful? Will future historians understand our emoji combinations? Will they be able to interpret our memes? Or will they look at our social media feeds and see only surfaces, only performances, only the digital equivalent of pristine gloves and elegant fans? Will they miss the people underneath? I hope not. I hope we are documenting our inner lives as well as our public presentations. I hope we are writing about our real feelings, our struggles, our joys. I hope we are being honest about what it means to be human in this particular moment in history, because that is what makes history valuable, not the facts and dates, though those matter, but the human experiences, the universal stuff that connects us across centuries, fear and hope, love and loss, the struggle to be seen and understood, the desire to connect with others, the need to express yourself, the wish to be remembered. These things have not changed. They will not change. They are what it means to be human, and whether you are expressing them through gloves and fans and perfume, or through texts and posts and carefully curated photos, you're doing the same fundamental thing. You're trying to bridge the distance between yourself and other people. You're trying to say, here I am. This is who I am. See me. Know me. Remember me. And that, I think, is beautiful. Across all the centuries, across all the different cultures and technologies and social systems, humans keep doing this. Keep trying to connect. Keep trying to matter. The tools change. The methods evolve. But the need remains constant. And there is something profoundly hopeful about that. About the persistence of this need. About the endless creativity humans bring to solving this eternal problem of how to be known. So what do you take from this? What do you do with these stories of women in gloves standing in ballrooms, trying to navigate impossible rules while still remaining themselves? I think you take the reminder that you are part of a long tradition. Every time you make a choice about how to present yourself, you're participating in something humans have been doing forever, and you can do it consciously, thoughtfully, with awareness of what you are communicating, or you can do it carelessly by default, letting accidents determine how you are seen. You can also take the reminder that constraints do not have to crush you. They can inspire you. Some of your best work, your most creative solutions, your deepest satisfactions might come from figuring out how to thrive within limitations. Not by giving up and accepting oppression, but by finding the spaces within constraints where you can still be yourself, still create beauty, still connect with others. And you can take the reminder that small things matter. The details of how you live your life, the care you put into your choices, the attention you pay to beauty and craftsmanship and quality. These are not trivial. These are not shallow. These are part of how you create meaning, how you express values, how you make your life feel like yours. The Regency women who spent hours caring for their gloves were not being frivolous. They were exercising care, practicing attention, creating small pockets of control and beauty in lives that often felt out of their control. You can do the same. Whatever your equivalent of gloves and fans and perfume is, whatever objects or practices or expressions matter in your world, you can approach them with intention, with care, with the understanding that these things are not just things. They are ways of being human, ways of saying something about who you are and what you value. But most of all, I hope you take the reminder that you are not alone. Every person who has ever lived has struggled with some version of these problems. How to present myself, how to connect with others, how to be authentic while also following social rules, how to find freedom within constraint, how to make my life meaningful. You're not the first person to wrestle with these questions. You will not be the last. And there is comfort in that. There is solidarity across time. Those Regency women, if they could speak to you now, would understand your struggles. They would recognize your fears and hopes. They would say, yes, it is hard, but you can do it. We did it. You will too. And 200 years from now, when people look back at our time, I hope they see us the way we have tried to see the Regency women tonight. Not as victims of our time, though we face real challenges. Not as shallow followers of trends, though we participate in fashion and culture, but as complex, creative, resilient people doing our best to live meaningful lives within the constraints of our particular moment in history. I hope they see our humanity. I hope they understand that we were trying, just like everyone before us, to connect, to matter, to be remembered. Because that is what this has all been about. Not gloves and fans and perfume specifically, but what they represented. The eternal human project of communication, of connection, of creating meaning in a world that does not automatically provide it. That project continues. It will always continue, and you are part of it. Right now, in your own way, you are figuring out how to be human in your particular circumstances, and that matters. Your efforts matter. Your creativity matters. Your small acts of beauty and care matter. You matter. So thank you for coming on this journey with me. Thank you for spending these hours in ballrooms and still rooms, learning about accessories that most people never think about, connecting with people who have been dead for 2 centuries. Thank you for your patience with details, your openness to seeing connections between past and present, your willingness to think deeply about seemingly shallow things. This has been a long journey, and you stayed with me, and I am genuinely grateful for that. I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope your dreams are filled with painted fans and rose water and candlelit ballrooms where everyone is trying so hard to connect, so hard to be understood, so hard to matter. And I hope when you wake up, you carry something of this with you. A little more consciousness about communication, a little more appreciation for craft and detail, a little more compassion for people, past and present, who are just trying to figure out how to be human. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more moments in history where people did extraordinary things, created beauty, solved problems, connected despite barriers, so many more lessons waiting to be discovered in the details of how people lived, and I will be here, ready to share those stories with you, ready to take you on more journeys through time, ready to help you see connections between then and now that change how you understand both. Until we meet again, take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. Remember that you are part of a long tradition of humans trying to figure things out. You're doing fine. You're doing better than fine. You're participating in the eternal human project of creating meaning and connection. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. Good night, dear friends, sweet dreams, and I will see you next time for another story, another journey, another chance to discover that the past is not as distant as we think, and that we are not as different from our ancestors as we like to believe. Sleep well,